For more than 3,000 years, he lay in silence beneath the limestone hills of the Valley of the Kings, sealed behind rubble and plaster, forgotten by the empire he once ruled and by the world that came after it. Dynasties rose and fell above him. Empires he never knew existed conquered the land of his ancestors. Persian satraps governed from cities he had never heard of. Greek pharaohs, descended from the general of a Macedonian conqueror, worshipped Egyptian gods in a language foreign to the temple's original priests. Roman emperors claimed the title of pharaoh while never setting foot upon the Nile at all. And the very language his own priests once chanted in golden temples faded from human memory. It sounds lost, its sacred symbols reduced to decoration on monuments no one could read. Egypt itself became a land of ruins admired by travelers who understood almost nothing of what they were looking at. And yet, in the autumn of 1922, when a narrow staircase was uncovered beneath centuries of accumulated debris in a quiet corner of that same royal valley, the world would come to know his name better than that of almost any other ruler in the whole of human history. He was not Egypt's greatest warrior. He conquered no foreign lands, led no great armies into decisive battle, and left behind no towering monuments to rival the temples of Karnak or the pyramids of Giza. He ruled for less than a decade, ascending to power as little more than a child and dying before he had reached the age of 20. By nearly every measure ancient Egyptians themselves used to judge the greatness of a king, his reign was brief, largely uneventful, and, in the eyes of some of his own successors, better forgotten entirely. His name was struck from later official king lists, omitted deliberately from the record of legitimate rulers, as though the men who came after him wished, for reasons of their own, that he had never existed at all. For more than 3,000 years, that erasure very nearly succeeded. And yet today, his golden mask is recognized instantly across the globe, reproduced on posters, textbooks, and museum banners from Cairo to Tokyo to New York. His name is spoken in classrooms by children who cannot name a single other Egyptian pharaoh, whispered with a kind of reverence usually reserved for gods rather than kings. Exhibitions of his treasures have drawn millions of visitors across every continent, and his image has become, in the modern imagination, nearly synonymous with the whole of ancient Egyptian civilization itself. How did a minor pharaoh, a boy who inherited a throne he did not choose and a crisis he did not create, come to eclipse the memory of rulers who conquered empires, raised the pyramids, and reigned in glory for 60 years or more? Part of the answer lies not in how he lived, but in how he was found. While the tombs of Egypt's most celebrated kings were discovered centuries ago already emptied by thieves, stripped of their treasures, their royal mummies disturbed, unwrapped, and in some cases scattered or destroyed entirely, his tomb endured, remarkably, almost untouched by either ancient robbers or the passage of time. Hidden by chance beneath the stone debris of a later, unrelated construction project, forgotten and literally buried beneath the accumulated rubbish of a busier corner of the valley, his burial chamber survived largely as it had been sealed in antiquity, more than 3,000 years earlier. When it was finally opened to modern eyes, it revealed not the empty, looted shell so familiar from other royal tombs, but a vision of Egyptian civilization preserved in an almost impossible level of detail. Furniture inlaid with ivory, ebony, and gold. Chariots built for a king who may never have ridden one in actual battle. Jewelry, weapons, board games, musical instruments, garments folded away in wooden chests, jars of wine still bearing the vintage and estate of their production, and thrones carved and gilded to a standard of craftsmanship that startled even experienced archaeologists, all left as offerings and provisions for a journey into the afterlife that the ancient Egyptians believed to be every bit as real and every bit as necessary as life itself. But behind the glittering objects lies a far more complicated and human story, one that begins not with treasure, but with turmoil. To understand who this young king truly was, and why his brief and largely powerless reign occupies such a strange and pivotal place in the story of ancient Egypt, it is necessary to travel back well before his birth, before the crisis that shaped the very inheritance he would receive, into an age when Egypt stood at the very height of its power, wealth, and international prestige. It is necessary to understand a golden age that seemed, to those who lived through it, as though it would last forever. It is necessary to understand a king whose prosperity became the stuff of legend even in his own lifetime, and a son of that king whose religious revolution would shake the very foundations of Egyptian civilization to their core, dividing a kingdom, dismantling ancient institutions, and leaving behind a legacy of instability that a single child would eventually be asked, impossibly, to resolve. It is necessary to ask difficult and, in some cases, still unanswered questions about family, about blood, about a succession crisis so obscure that historians continue to debate its details even today. Only once these foundations are understood does the story of the boy king begin to make sense. Not as an isolated curiosity of history, a mere footnote made famous by golden treasure, but as the fragile, uncertain, and deeply human outcome of one of the most turbulent and consequential chapters in the entire history of ancient Egypt. This is the story of how that world was built. This is the story of how it began, gradually and then suddenly, to unravel. And this is the story of how a child, barely old enough to understand the crown that was placed upon his head, came to sit upon a throne balanced precariously between restoration and ruin, inheriting a kingdom whose fate rested almost entirely in the hands of others. By the middle centuries of the second millennium before the Common Era, Egypt had already existed as a unified civilization for well over 1,000 years, its origins reaching back to the legendary unification of the Nile Valley under its earliest kings. Yet it was during the period modern historians call the 18th dynasty that the kingdom reached a level of wealth, political power, and cultural sophistication that few, if any, civilizations of the ancient world would ever match. This was the heart of what scholars now term the New Kingdom, an era in which Egypt was no longer simply a prosperous kingdom clustered along the banks of a single river, but a true empire, whose direct rule or dominant influence stretched from the mountains and gold mines of Nubia in the south to the contested river valleys and city-states of Syria and the Levant in the north. The foundations of this greatness had been laid a century or more earlier, in the aftermath of a period of internal division and foreign rule under the Hyksos, rulers of West Asian origin who had come to control significant portions of northern Egypt during a time of Egyptian weakness and fragmentation. Their eventual expulsion, achieved through sustained military campaigns led by Egyptian kings ruling from the southern city of Thebes, left behind a powerful and lasting legacy. A newly and forcefully reunified nation, a hardened and increasingly professional military tradition, and a determination among Egypt's rulers that their kingdom must never again be permitted to fall under foreign domination. Successive pharaohs pressed this advantage further still, launching campaigns deep into the Levant and southward into Nubia, until Egypt controlled, whether directly through conquest or indirectly through a network of vassal states and tribute-paying territories, an extraordinary swath of the ancient Near Eastern world. Tribute, raw materials, and captives flowed steadily into Egypt from conquered and allied lands alike, and with them came a wealth so vast that it transformed nearly every dimension of Egyptian society, from the grandeur of its temples to the daily bread of its farmers. At the center of this wealth stood the pharaoh, a figure whose authority rested simultaneously on political power, military command, and profound religious belief. To the Egyptians, the king was not merely a ruler in the way later civilizations understood the term, a chief magistrate or a hereditary noble elevated above his peers. He was considered the living embodiment of the god Horus upon the earth, a divine intermediary standing between the human world and the realm of the gods, personally responsible for maintaining an abstract yet essential concept the Egyptians called Ma'at, an idea encompassing truth, balance, justice, and the correct cosmic order of the universe itself. It was believed, sincerely and pervasively, that if the pharaoh properly fulfilled his religious duties, performing the correct rituals, honoring the correct gods, and living in accordance with Ma'at, the Nile would flood at its appointed season, the crops would grow in abundance, and Egypt would remain in harmony with the wider universe. If he failed in these sacred obligations, chaos, called Isfit, might creep into the world, threatening not merely the political order but the fundamental stability of existence itself. This belief gave the pharaoh enormous, almost unchallengeable authority, but it also placed enormous, unrelenting expectations upon him. Expectations that would later weigh with particular heaviness upon a young and inexperienced king thrust unexpectedly onto the throne of a fractured kingdom. Supporting the pharaoh at every level was an intricate and highly developed bureaucracy that administered the kingdom's vast resources, its lands, and its labor. Egypt's economy in this period remained fundamentally agricultural, sustained above all by the predictable and life-giving annual flooding of the Nile River, which deposited rich black silt across the floodplain each year and allowed for abundant harvests of wheat, barley, flax, and a wide variety of vegetables and fruits. This agricultural surplus freed a significant portion of the population to work in specialized trades, and it funded the ambitious building projects, sustained military campaigns, and elaborate international diplomacy that came to define the era. Grain was stored in vast state and temple granaries and functioned in many respects as a form of currency, since Egypt had not yet adopted coined money, with wages, rations, and even certain taxes calculated and paid in measures of grain, beer, and bread. Taxes, largely rendered in agricultural produce and in obligatory labor service, sustained not only the royal court but the temples and the standing army as well, binding together the economic life of the entire nation. Religion touched every part of Egyptian existence during this period, structuring not only personal belief and daily ritual but political and economic power as well. Temples were not simply places of quiet worship. They were vast and often extraordinarily wealthy economic institutions in their own right, owning enormous tracts of farmland, herds of cattle, fleets of boats, and workshops of every kind, and employing thousands of priests, scribes, craftsmen, and laborers across the country. Among these temples, the most powerful by far was the Temple of Amunius at Karnak, in the southern city of Thebes, which had grown, over the course of several centuries, into the preeminent religious center of the entire kingdom. Ammonius, once a relatively minor local deity associated with the Theban region, had risen to supreme national prominence, frequently merged with the ancient sun god Ra into the composite deity Onius Ra, regarded as king of the gods and the divine patron of the pharaoh himself. The wealth and influence accumulated by the priesthood of Ammonius during this long period of expansion would later become a significant and unavoidable political force in Egyptian affairs, one whose power a future king would attempt, dramatically and with lasting controversy, to challenge and dismantle. Beyond religion and agriculture, international trade and diplomacy further enriched Egyptian society at every level. Egyptian ships carried goods along the length of the Nile and across the eastern Mediterranean, while overland caravan routes connected Egypt to the gold-bearing lands of Nubia in the south and the trading kingdoms of the Near East to the north and east. Gold, arguably Egypt's single most valuable resource, flowed from mines in Nubia and the eastern desert in such extraordinary quantities that Egypt's neighbors, in surviving diplomatic correspondence, remarked that Egyptian gold seemed to them as plentiful and inexhaustible as dust upon the ground. This gold funded not only lavish royal building projects and generous temple offerings, but also an extensive and sophisticated web of international diplomacy. Egyptian pharaohs exchanged elaborate gifts, formal diplomatic correspondence, and dynastic marriage alliances with foreign rulers in Babylon, Mitanni, Assyria, and beyond, forging a delicate and carefully managed balance of power across the ancient Near East. Egypt's considerable military strength, meanwhile, rooted in a professional standing army equipped with bronze weaponry, and, since earlier centuries, horse-drawn chariots introduced from Western Asia, ensured that this diplomacy was consistently backed by genuine and credible deterrent force. A combination of soft and hard power that allowed Egypt to dominate the affairs of the region for generations without needing to fight constant wars to maintain that dominance. Monumental architecture rose across the land as visible, enduring testimony to Egypt's wealth, piety, and confidence. Pharaohs expanded and adorned the great temple complexes of Thebes, particularly Karnak and Luxor, with towering stone pylons, forests of massive columns carved with religious scenes and royal inscriptions, obelisks capped in gleaming electrum, and long avenues lined with statues of gods, kings, and sacred animals. Across the river, on the western bank where the sun set each evening into the realm of the dead, vast mortuary temples and the rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings testified to the Egyptians' deep and abiding preoccupation with the afterlife. An eternal existence they believed depended upon proper burial, carefully preserved remains, and the continued, uninterrupted performance of funerary rituals long after a king's death. For the great majority of Egypt's population, this age of empire and international prestige was experienced not through the grand language of diplomacy or conquest, but through the far more immediate realities of daily existence along the banks of the Nile. The overwhelming majority of Egyptians lived as farmers, tied closely to a landscape whose rhythms had changed little across the centuries, working fields of emmer wheat and barley that stretched along the floodplain. Their labor structured around the Nile's yearly cycle of inundation, planting, and harvest, a cycle so central to Egyptian life that it shaped their very conception of time itself, divided into the season of flooding, the season of growth, and the season of harvest. Villages of mud brick homes clustered along canals and irrigation channels, their inhabitants organized into households that often included extended family across several generations, sharing labor, resources, and the unpredictable risks of a harvest that could still, in poor years, fail despite the Nile's general reliability. Beyond the fields, Egypt's towns and cities bustled with specialized trades made possible by this agricultural surplus. Potters shaping vessels for storage and daily use, weavers producing linen cloth of varying fineness for every level of society, carpenters and metalworkers supplying the tools, furnishings, and weapons required by both humble households and royal workshops, and scribes, a comparatively small but socially significant and much respected class who staffed the administrative apparatus that recorded harvests, assessed taxes, and carried out the voluminous correspondence of an empire spanning hundreds of miles. Markets in great cities such as Thebes and Memphis offered a striking cross-section of Egypt's prosperity, with exotic goods arriving from Nubia, the Levant, and lands beyond, displayed alongside the produce of local fields and workshops, and the presence of imported luxury items even in the households of moderately prosperous Egyptians speaks to just how deeply the wealth of empire had penetrated Egyptian society by this period, even if that wealth remained, as in most ancient civilizations, distributed with dramatic and often stark inequality between the splendor of the royal court and the more precarious circumstances of the rural poor. It was into this world of extraordinary wealth, deep religious devotion, wide international influence, and firm political stability that Amenhotep III ascended to the throne, inheriting an empire at the very peak of its power. Amenhotep III came to the throne while still a boy, likely no older than 12 years of age, but he would go on to rule Egypt for close to 4 decades, a reign so long, so peaceful, and so prosperous that later generations would remember it as something close to a golden age of unmatched abundance. He inherited a kingdom already secure in its borders and rich in resources, the product of his predecessors' sustained military campaigns, and rather than continuing an aggressive policy of expansion and conquest, Amenhotep III largely maintained peace through diplomacy, carefully arranged marriage alliances, and the deliberate, ceremonial projection of Egyptian wealth and power to friend and rival alike. Military action was not entirely absent from his reign, with at least one significant campaign recorded in Nubia early in his rule, but compared to the martial ambitions and battlefield glory sought by earlier and later pharaohs, his reign was defined far more decisively by prosperity, construction, and ceremony than by war. Under his leadership, Egypt's accumulated wealth reached truly staggering proportions. Nubian gold mines operated at full capacity, funding building projects on a scale scarcely seen before or since in Egyptian history. Amenhotep III commissioned an extraordinary mortuary temple on the western bank of the Nile at Thebes, a structure so immense that ancient descriptions and archaeological remains suggest it may have rivaled or even exceeded the great temple complexes of Karnak in overall size, though today only fragments of this once colossal monument remain, most famously the twin-seated colossi that once guarded its entrance. Statues so massive and so imposing that they continued to awe travelers and visitors. for thousands of years after the temple that once surrounded them had crumbled almost entirely into ruin and dust. He also undertook major expansions at the Temple of Amunius at Karnak, adding new courts, pylons, and statuary, and built extensively at nearby Luxor, adding a magnificent colonnade hall and courtyard, its papyrus bundle columns rising toward the sky. That still stands today as one of the most beautiful and harmonious examples of Egyptian temple architecture to survive into the modern era. Beyond Thebes, he constructed a vast palace complex at Malkata on the western bank of the river, a sprawling city of mud brick halls, painted floors, artificial lakes, and gardens, designed not merely as a royal residence, but as an elaborate stage for royal ceremony and public celebration, including the great Jubilee festivals called the Hebsed, ancient rituals of renewal intended to rejuvenate the aging king's strength and reaffirm, before gods and subjects alike, his continued fitness to rule. At Malkata, archaeological excavation has revealed a city of remarkable scale and comfort, its walls once painted with vivid scenes of birds in flight over marshland, its floors decorated with images of fish gliding through painted pools of blue and green, and its grounds including an enormous artificial harbor connected directly to the Nile, wide enough, according to the scale suggested by its surviving outline, to have accommodated royal barges and to have served as a magnificent stage for elaborate waterborne festivals celebrated before crowds of officials and subjects. The labor required to construct such a complex, along with the temples, colossi, and countless other monuments Amenhotep III commissioned across the length of his reign, drew upon the coordinated efforts of thousands of laborers, craftsmen, and administrators, a workforce sustained by the very agricultural surplus and taxation that bound the humblest Egyptian farmer, however geographically and socially distant from the glittering royal court, into the same vast economic system that produced such splendor at its summit. International correspondence from this period, preserved in a remarkable cache of clay tablets discovered many centuries later at Akhenaten and known today as the Amarna letters, offers vivid and often surprisingly intimate testimony to Egypt's diplomatic reach during and just after Amenhotep III's reign. Foreign kings addressed the Egyptian pharaoh as a peer and an equal, their tone at times bordering on flattery, at times on genuine desperation, requesting gold in quantities they openly described as being, in Egypt, as abundant and inexhaustible as sand itself. Marriage alliances bound Egypt to the great courts of the wider Near East, and Amenhotep III took wives from Mitanni and Babylon among his many marriages, weaving Egypt into an intricate web of dynastic relationships that spanned much of the known world of his day. Trade goods, luxury items, exotic animals, and elaborate diplomatic gifts flowed steadily into the royal court, filling palace storerooms with an abundance so remarkable that later Egyptian art and inscription described his reign as a time when the whole known world came bearing tribute to Egypt's door, a boastful claim, certainly, yet one grounded in a genuine and well-documented reality of Egyptian wealth and international standing during these decades. At the center of this glittering court stood the royal family, and Amenhotep III's marriage to his great royal wife, Tai, would prove to be one of the most consequential and influential unions in the whole of Egyptian royal history. Unlike many royal wives before her, Tai was not of foreign or even necessarily elite royal blood. Her parents, Yuya and Chu, held prominent and respected positions at court, Yuya serving as a senior official and possibly a military commander, but neither was part of the traditional royal lineage stretching back through earlier generations of pharaohs. And yet Tai rose to become perhaps the most powerful and publicly visible queen Egypt had known up to that point in its long history. She appeared prominently alongside her husband in official art and monumental inscriptions, in a manner that departed noticeably from the more restrained public presence of earlier royal wives, was referenced directly and by name in diplomatic correspondence from foreign rulers who clearly regarded her as a figure of genuine political consequence, and continued to wield considerable influence, respect, and independent authority even after her husband's eventual death. Her prominence set an important and lasting precedent within the royal court, establishing a stronger and more visible public and political role for royal women that would echo through the following decades, most visibly and most dramatically in the extraordinary status later held by Nefertiti. Amenhotep III and Tai had several children together, a family whose members appear repeatedly in the art and inscriptions of the period, and it is within this royal household, amid immense wealth, elaborate court ceremony, and a kingdom basking in unprecedented and seemingly boundless prosperity, that the child who would grow up to transform Egyptian religion beyond recognition was born. A prince originally named Amenhotep, destined, in time, to inherit his father's throne, though few at the time of his birth could possibly have imagined how radically he would come to reshape the very civilization into which he had been born. To understand the magnitude of what this prince would eventually attempt, it is necessary first to understand, in some detail, the religious world into which he was born, a world built upon millennia of accumulated tradition and belief. Ancient Egyptian religion, by this point in history, was not a single unified system of doctrine, but a vast and richly layered accumulation of local cults, regional deities, competing mythologies, and overlapping traditions, developed, adapted, and reworked across more than 1,000 years of civilization. The Egyptians worshipped a great many gods, each associated with particular aspects of the natural world, human experience, or cosmic order. Ra, the great sun god, journeyed across the sky each day in his solar bark and through the perilous underworld each night, battling the forces of chaos to ensure the continuation of time itself, a nightly drama upon which the Egyptians believed the very stability of existence depended. Osiris, murdered by his own brother and resurrected through the devotion of his wife according to sacred myth, ruled over the realm of the dead and offered the promise of eternal life and judgment to those who followed the proper funerary rites and lived according to Mot. Isis, his devoted and resourceful wife, represented magic, healing, and maternal protection, and was worshipped across every level of Egyptian society. Ammonius, whose name meant the Hidden One, had risen from a relatively obscure local Theban deity to become fused with Ra as the supreme state god, Ammonius Ra, king of the gods and patron of the pharaoh himself, his temple at Karnak growing, over centuries of royal patronage, into perhaps the single wealthiest religious institution anywhere in the ancient world. This religious system was deeply and inseparably tied to political power at every level. Temples across Egypt owned enormous tracts of farmland, vast herds of cattle, and considerable workforces of laborers and craftsmen, and their priesthoods, particularly the priesthood of Ammonius at Thebes, wielded significant economic and political influence alongside their purely religious authority, controlling resources that in some periods may have rivaled those of the crown itself. The pharaoh, as already noted, held a unique and singular position within this system, considered a divine intermediary responsible for maintaining Mot, and much of royal ritual life centered on elaborate temple ceremony, regular offerings to the gods, and the ongoing construction and maintenance of religious monuments intended to endure for eternity. It was a system that had endured, with periodic adaptation and reinterpretation, for well over a millennium, deeply embedded in Egyptian identity, art, government, and the daily texture of life. For an ordinary Egyptian, from the humblest farmer working the black earth of the floodplain to the most elevated scribe serving in the royal administration, the presence of the gods was inseparable from the rhythm of existence itself, present in the flooding of the Nile, the rising of the sun each morning, the birth of a child, the healing of an illness, and the promise of survival beyond death into a blessed eternity. It was within this deeply traditional and firmly established religious landscape that Prince Amenhotep, son of Amenhotep III and Tai, grew from childhood into manhood and eventually ascended the throne as Amenhotep IV. Historical records concerning his early life before his accession remain frustratingly sparse, offering only fragments from which historians must attempt to reconstruct a fuller picture. Some scholars have suggested he may not have originally been considered the primary heir to the throne, pointing to an elder brother, Prince Thutmose, referenced in a small number of surviving inscriptions, who appears to have died before he could inherit, leaving Amenhotep IV to become his father's eventual successor more by circumstance than by original design or lifelong preparation. If accurate, this would mean that the prince who would go on to attempt one of history's most dramatic religious transformations may not have been raised from earliest childhood with the singular, unwavering expectation of one day ruling Egypt, a detail that, while unconfirmed by direct evidence, adds intriguing and suggestive context to the unconventional path his eventual reign would take. There remains continuing scholarly debate over whether Amenhotep IV ruled for a period as co-regent alongside his aging father, sharing royal authority during an overlapping span of years before Amenhotep III's death, or whether he assumed the throne entirely independently only after his father had already died. The evidence bearing on this question, drawn largely from artistic and architectural details whose precise dating remains genuinely contested among specialists, has not produced a firm scholarly consensus even after decades of study, and this documentary presents the succession according to the interpretation most broadly supported by current Egyptological opinion, that Amenhotep IV began his reign following his father's death, inheriting an empire of immense wealth, deep stability, and unbroken religious tradition stretching back over 1,000 years. In the early years of his reign, Amenhotep IV appears to have ruled in a manner largely consistent with his predecessors, continuing traditional temple construction, including modest additions at Karnak dedicated to the long-established gods of the Egyptian pantheon. Yet within these very same early years, something new begins to emerge with increasing clarity in the historical and archaeological record, a rapidly growing devotion to a solar deity known as the Aten, represented not in human or animal form as the vast majority of other Egyptian gods traditionally were, but as the visible disk of the sun itself, its rays extending downward toward the earth and ending in small, delicate hands, several of which are depicted holding out the Ankh, the ancient Egyptian symbol of life, toward members of the royal family below. The Aten had existed as a relatively minor aspect of broader solar worship for many generations before this point, present in earlier religious texts and royal titulary. But under Amenhotep IV, it began to receive unprecedented and rapidly intensifying royal attention, its distinctive imagery appearing with increasing frequency across official monuments constructed within the very first years of his reign. This growing personal devotion soon accelerated into something far more radical and unprecedented. Amenhotep IV began constructing a series of open-air temples dedicated to the Aten at Karnak itself, remarkably situated near the very heart of the traditional cult of Ammonius, structures whose design departed sharply and deliberately from conventional Egyptian temple architecture, built entirely without the roofed inner sanctuaries traditionally used to house a hidden, protected divine presence. In order to allow worshippers, and the god himself, direct and wholly unobstructed exposure to the light and warmth of the sun. It was during this early and increasingly turbulent period that the king appears to have begun elevating the Aten decisively above the entire traditional Egyptian pantheon, not merely as one god among a great many, honored alongside the others as royal piety traditionally required, but as a supreme, singular, and increasingly exclusive object of veneration. What began as personal devotion soon transformed into an extraordinary and unmistakable declaration of religious identity. Sometime within the first 5 years of his reign, the king abandoned the name Amenhotep, meaning Ammonius is satisfied, and adopted an entirely new name, Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, a symbolic and deeply deliberate rejection of the very deity whose name he had carried since birth, and whose priesthood had, until that moment, stood as the single most powerful religious institution in the entire land. The transformation from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten was not merely a matter of changing a royal name upon a handful of monuments. It represented the beginning of one of the most extraordinary religious upheavals in the recorded history of the ancient world, a deliberate and increasingly uncompromising campaign to reorder the very foundations of Egyptian belief. Where Egyptian religion had for centuries embraced a vast and richly layered pantheon, each deity governing a different aspect of existence and cooperating within a complex and generally harmonious mythological system, Akhenaten began to promote the Aten not simply as the greatest among many gods, a position other pharaohs had claimed for their own favored deities in the past, but eventually as the only god truly deserving of worship at all, a radical theological departure that some historians consider the earliest large-scale expression of monotheism anywhere in recorded history. Though scholars continue to debate, without full resolution, whether this belief system is more accurately described as monotheism, in which only one god is believed to exist at all, or henotheism, in which a single god is elevated decisively above others without entirely denying their continued existence in some diminished form. As his reign progressed, Akhenaten's devotion to the Aten intensified steadily into open and unmistakable hostility toward the traditional gods, and above all toward Ammonius, the very deity whose favor his own birth name had once proclaimed. Inscriptions and reliefs from temples throughout Egypt reveal a systematic campaign, carried out by direct royal order, to erase the name of Ammonius from monuments across the entire kingdom. Workers were dispatched to chisel away the god's name from temple walls, statues, and inscriptions, sometimes climbing dangerously to remove his name from the ceilings of shrines, even in cases where doing so required damaging or defacing the very monuments that Akhenaten's own royal ancestors had built to honor that same god. In some instances, the plural Egyptian word for gods itself was also specifically targeted for removal, suggesting that this campaign was not merely an attack on one particular rival deity, however powerful, but represented an attempt to dismantle the entire conceptual framework of Egyptian polytheism itself, a far more sweeping and radical ambition than a simple change in royal religious preference. This sustained campaign carried severe and lasting consequences for the powerful priesthood of Ammonius, an institution that had accumulated vast landholdings, considerable material wealth, and significant political influence over the course of many preceding generations. As royal patronage and state resources shifted decisively and rapidly toward the new Aten cult, temple-building projects dedicated to Ammonius and the other traditional gods stagnated and, in many cases, ceased entirely. Existing temple economies were severely disrupted, and many among the priesthood found their traditional roles, incomes, and religious authority diminished or eliminated altogether, virtually overnight by the standards of a civilization accustomed to continuity across centuries. Some scholars view this dimension of Akhenaten's revolution as being motivated, at least in significant part, by genuine political calculation as much as by sincere religious conviction, an attempt to break decisively the economic and political power the Ammonius priesthood had steadily accumulated, and to consolidate authority more directly and completely around the person of the king himself, whose special and exclusive relationship with the Aten positioned him as the sole legitimate intermediary between the god and all of humanity. Other scholars emphasize instead the apparent depth and evident sincerity of Akhenaten's personal religious devotion, as expressed in surviving hymns and inscriptions of striking poetic and theological ambition, suggesting that the political consequences of his reforms, however severe and far-reaching, may have been secondary to a genuine and deeply felt theological transformation taking place within the king himself. Both explanations are considered credible by serious modern historians, and the true balance between political motivation and sincere religious conviction likely can never be established with complete certainty from the surviving evidence alone. Beyond Thebes, the consequences of this religious upheaval rippled outward across the entire kingdom. Temples dedicated to traditional gods throughout Egypt saw their state support diminish sharply, their priesthoods reduced in numbers and influence, and in some documented cases their doors effectively closed to active worship altogether, though the precise extent of such closures across the entire country remains a subject of ongoing archaeological investigation, since the surviving evidence is considerably more thorough and complete at some sites than at others. For the ordinary population of Egypt, whose daily and religious lives had for generations been woven inseparably around temple festivals, local cult worship, and the constant intercession of familiar gods for matters of health, fertility, harvest, and protection from misfortune, this sudden and sweeping transformation must have represented a profound and unsettling disruption. While the full extent to which common Egyptians outside the royal court and religious elite genuinely adopted or quietly resisted the new religion of Atenism remains difficult to determine with confidence from the surviving evidence, the disruption to established religious and economic life, and to a belief system that had structured Egyptian existence for well over a millennium, would have been keenly and personally felt at every level of society, from the highest temple official to the humblest village farmer. Perhaps the single most dramatic expression of Akhenaten's religious revolution was his decision to abandon Thebes altogether, the ancient religious heart of Egypt and enduring stronghold of the Ammonian priesthood, and to construct an entirely new capital city dedicated exclusively to the worship of the Aten. He selected a site roughly midway between Thebes and Memphis, on the eastern bank of the Nile, in a broad stretch of desert plain encircled by protective cliffs that had, according to inscriptions the king himself personally commissioned, never before been dedicated to any other god or goddess, nor claimed as sacred ground by any previous king. This, in Akhenaten's own carefully worded account, made the location uniquely and providentially suited to the Aten, untouched by any prior religious claim, and therefore entirely free from association with the traditional pantheon he sought so deliberately to leave behind. He named the new city Akhenaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, and declared it his eternal and permanent capital, marking its boundaries with a series of large stone boundaries steely carved directly into the surrounding cliffs, each inscribed with solemn royal oaths never to extend the city's borders beyond those he had personally designated, and never to be buried anywhere else upon his eventual death. Construction of Akhenaten proceeded with extraordinary and almost unprecedented speed, likely completed in only a few short years, an achievement made possible in part through the use of a new and highly efficient building technique employing small, easily transportable sandstone blocks known today to Egyptologists as talatat, which allowed entire structures to be raised far more quickly than through the traditional and laborious method of quarrying, transporting, and positioning massive, individual stone blocks. The city that rapidly emerged from the empty desert was laid out along a great processional road running parallel to the Nile, connecting royal residences, government and administrative buildings, and temples dedicated exclusively to the Aten. Unlike the temples of Ammonius at Karnak, with their shadowed, mysterious inner sanctuaries designed specifically to house a hidden and protected divine presence, the temples of Akhenaten were built largely open to the sky, vast unroofed courts filled with row upon row of offering tables, designed explicitly to allow the sun's rays, believed sincerely to be the living, visible presence of the Aten itself, to fall directly and continuously upon the altars and the worshippers gathered before them. At the very heart of the city stood the royal residence, a sprawling complex of palaces, gardens, and administrative buildings, connected by an elevated bridge spanning the great processional road to a smaller structure believed to have served important ceremonial functions, from which the royal family could appear publicly before the gathered population below in a ritual display known to modern scholars as the window of appearance, a ceremony in which the king and his family showed themselves to assembled officials and citizens, often distributing lavish gifts of gold and other valuable rewards to loyal and deserving servants of the crown. Surrounding this central royal and religious district, the city spread outward into extensive residential neighborhoods housing officials, priests, craftsmen, and laborers of every rank, along with workshops producing pottery, glass, jewelry, and the countless other goods required to sustain a functioning royal capital of considerable size and ambition. The rhythms of ordinary existence within Akhenaten, though reshaped by the demands of a new state religion, nonetheless retained much of the familiar texture of Egyptian daily life found elsewhere along the Nile. Excavations of the city's residential districts have revealed homes of markedly varying size and comfort, from the spacious villas of senior officials, complete with private gardens, painted reception rooms, and household shrines, down to the more modest, closely packed dwellings of ordinary laborers and craftsmen in the district archaeologists now refer to as the workmen's village, a walled settlement believed to have housed those employed in constructing and maintaining the tombs cut into the surrounding cliffs, its narrow streets and small mud-brick homes offering a striking and instructive contrast to the grandeur of the royal quarter nearby. Bakeries, breweries, and granaries supplied the city's population with the essential staple foods of Egyptian life, bread and beer, produced in quantities sufficient to sustain many thousands of residents, while workshops scattered throughout the city produced faience jewelry, glass vessels, and painted pottery, some of it destined for the royal court itself, some intended for wider distribution among the city's population. Clear evidence of a functioning and fully developed urban economy, operating alongside and in direct service to the religious mission that stood at the city's very heart. For officials transplanted from Thebes and Memphis, adaptation to life in this new and rapidly constructed capital would have meant not only physical relocation to unfamiliar surroundings, but a genuine reorientation of religious and professional identity, as careers once built around faithful service to Ammonius or other traditional cults were redirected, often abruptly, toward the Aten and toward the person of the king himself, upon whom the entire structure of the new city's religious and political life had been made to depend, in a manner far more concentrated and absolute than had generally characterized the more distributed and pluralistic religious landscape of earlier Egyptian history. Daily life within Akhenaten, as reconstructed by archaeologists from the extensive material remains uncovered at the site over the course of more than a century of excavation, appears to have revolved heavily around the daily rhythms of solar worship and elaborate royal ceremony. The sun's rising and setting structured religious observance in ways that departed sharply from the temple-centered worship practiced elsewhere in Egypt, with hymns composed during this period, including verses closely associated with Akhenaten himself, describing the Aten's daily journey across the sky as the singular source of all life, warmth, and sustenance in the entire world, its rays nourishing not only Egypt but all peoples and creatures upon the earth without distinction, a notably universal theological claim compared to the more traditionally Egypt-centered focus of earlier religious texts. For officials and courtiers who relocated to the new capital, life meant valuable proximity to the king and access to his personal favor, but it also meant physical distance from ancestral homes, established religious centers, and, for many, from careers and family traditions rooted deeply in the old temple institutions now fallen abruptly from royal favor. For craftsmen, laborers, and the broader population who came to inhabit the city, whether by royal command or simple economic necessity, life in Akhenaten meant direct participation, willing or otherwise, in an unprecedented religious experiment being carried out under close and constant royal supervision. In a city built specifically to embody and enforce its founder's singular and uncompromising vision of the divine. At the center of this new religious world, standing directly alongside Akhenaten himself, was his great royal wife, Nefertiti, a queen whose prominence within the art and ideology of this remarkable period was without any clear precedent in the whole of Egyptian history. Her name, meaning the beautiful one has come, and her image, most famously preserved in the strikingly lifelike and hauntingly beautiful painted limestone bust discovered in the workshop of the master sculptor Thutmose at Akhenaten, have made her one of the single most recognizable figures to survive from the entire ancient world. But Nefertiti's true significance extended far beyond her celebrated physical beauty as captured in Egyptian art. Temple reliefs from this period depict her participating directly and personally in religious ritual, performing offerings to the Aten in scenes traditionally reserved for the king alone, and in a number of representations she appears equal in scale and prominence to Akhenaten himself. An artistic choice that strongly suggests a queen wielding religious and political authority far beyond that typically afforded to Egyptian royal wives of earlier generations. Some scholars have gone considerably further still, proposing that Nefertiti may have exercised power approaching genuine co-regency in the later years of Akhenaten's reign, and a small number of specialists have even suggested she may be identifiable with a shadowy figure known from later inscriptions under a different royal throne name. Though this particular theory remains a matter of vigorous and unresolved scholarly debate rather than settled historical fact, Akhenaten and Nefertiti had at least 6 daughters together, whose images appear with striking frequency throughout the surviving art of the Amarna period. often shown accompanying their parents during religious ceremonies, seated affectionately upon their laps, or gathered together as a family beneath the life-giving rays of the Aten, in scenes of a domestic intimacy rare in earlier Egyptian royal art, which had traditionally favored a far more formal and distant presentation of the king and his household. This artistic intimacy forms part of a broader stylistic revolution that accompanied Akhenaten's religious transformation, a marked departure from the idealized, rigidly formal conventions of earlier Egyptian royal art toward a strikingly naturalistic, at times deliberately exaggerated style, depicting members of the royal family with elongated skulls, full hips, slender limbs, and softened, almost androgynous facial features. Historians continue to debate the underlying reasons behind this dramatic and sudden artistic shift, with some viewing it as a direct reflection of genuine religious ideology, perhaps intended to depict the royal family as living embodiments of the Aten's life-giving and androgynous creative power, while others suggest the possibility of underlying medical or genetic conditions present within the royal family, though this particular theory remains unproven and genuinely contested among specialists in Egyptian art history and paleopathology alike. Among Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughters, the second-born, a princess named Ankhesenamun, would later come to occupy an especially significant place in the story that follows, her personal fate becoming closely and permanently intertwined with that of the young prince who would eventually inherit Akhenaten's complicated and deeply troubled legacy. But before her story can properly be told, attention must first turn to a question that lies at the very heart of this entire history, one that modern historians and scientists continue to investigate through art, inscription, and, in recent years, sophisticated genetic analysis. The question of who, precisely, this young prince's own parents actually were. For decades, the identity of Tutankhamun's parents remained one of the most contested and frustrating puzzles in the entire field of Egyptology, complicated significantly by the deliberate erasure of records from the Amarna period carried out by later rulers eager to distance themselves from Akhenaten's religious revolution and its unsettling memory, and further complicated by the frustratingly incomplete state of the surviving archaeological and, until recently, genetic evidence. No inscription discovered to date explicitly names his mother by name, and while several of Akhenaten's own monuments refer to the existence of a son, direct and unambiguous confirmation linking that particular child by name to the boy who would later become Tutankhamun has proven remarkably elusive within the surviving textual record alone. The most significant advance in resolving this long-standing question came in 2010, when a team of Egyptian and international researchers conducted extensive genetic analysis on a group of royal mummies from this general period, including Tutankhamun himself. The results indicated that Tutankhamun's father was, with a high degree of scientific confidence, a mummy identified as belonging to the individual found in a small side chamber of a Valley of the King's tomb known by its excavation number as KV55, a mummy that many, though notably not all, Egyptologists identify as Akhenaten himself, based on associated funerary equipment and inscriptional evidence recovered from within that same tomb, though a minority of scholars have proposed alternative identifications, including Akhenaten's shadowy and short-lived successor Smenkhare, whose brief reign and uncertain historical identity remain themselves subjects of considerable and unresolved scholarly debate. If the KV55 mummy is indeed Akhenaten, as most current mainstream scholarship holds to be the case, then Tutankhamun was almost certainly the direct son of the very king who had upended, quite deliberately, Egyptian religious tradition. The identity of Tutankhamun's mother has proven considerably more difficult to establish with confidence, and it remains, even today, genuinely and openly unresolved. The same landmark genetic study identified her, based on careful DNA comparison, as a previously unidentified mummy discovered without any accompanying inscription in a nearby side chamber of a different tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a woman researchers have referred to, for lack of any confirmed name, only by the working designation the younger lady. Crucially, the genetic evidence indicated that this woman was a full sibling of the KV55 mummy identified as Tutankhamun's father, meaning that, if that identification is correct, Tutankhamun's own parents were full brother and sister. This particular finding has generated considerable and ongoing scholarly discussion in the decades since it was first published. Some historians note that sibling and other forms of close-kin marriage, while certainly not universal practice, were not entirely unknown within Egyptian royal families of this era, understood by the Egyptians themselves as a deliberate means of preserving and concentrating a sacred and divine royal bloodline. Though the practice was almost certainly far less common in actual occurrence than is sometimes assumed in popular accounts of ancient Egypt, and does not appear to have been treated as the ordinary norm even among Egyptian royalty generally. Other scholars urge considerable caution regarding the genetic findings themselves, noting the significant technical challenges involved in extracting and reliably analyzing ancient DNA from human remains that are more than 3,000 years old and have been exposed, across the intervening millennia, to environmental degradation, potential contamination, and the generally deteriorating effects of time. Challenges that make absolute scientific certainty genuinely elusive even when working with the most modern and sophisticated laboratory methods available. The precise identity of the younger Lady Mummy herself remains, in turn, a matter of active and unresolved scholarly debate. She has not yet been conclusively identified with any specific named individual known from surviving Egyptian records, and while a small number of scholars have speculated that she might be identified with one of Akhenaten's known secondary wives, or possibly with an otherwise unattested sister of Akhenaten mentioned nowhere else in the surviving evidence, no firm scholarly consensus has emerged on the matter. Notably absent from serious consideration as Tutankhamun's mother, based on the available genetic evidence, is Nefertiti herself, since the DNA results indicate that his mother was Akhenaten's own sister, whereas Nefertiti's own parentage, while itself not entirely certain, is not typically understood by specialists to make her Akhenaten's sister in this same direct biological sense. This particular detail, drawn from ongoing genetic research still being refined and reassessed, has led many current scholars to conclude that Nefertiti, whatever her considerable power and public prominence at court, was very likely not Tutankhamun's biological mother, though the matter continues to be discussed, debated, and refined as scientific techniques improve further and as scholars continue to weigh the available genetic evidence carefully against the artistic and inscriptional record. What remains firmly established and genuinely undisputed among mainstream scholars working in this field is that Tutankhamun was a member of the royal family descended directly from Akhenaten's own line, born at a moment when that family's religious and political revolution stood at the very center of Egyptian national life. Tutankhamun's birth itself, like so much of this obscure and contested period's history, was not directly recorded in any surviving inscription bearing his birth name alongside a precise date, and modern historians must rely instead on a careful combination of genetic evidence, archaeological context, and estimated chronology in order to place his birth within the later years of Akhenaten's reign, most likely at Akhenaten itself, the very city his father had built from empty desert as a permanent monument to religious revolution. He was given, at birth, the name Tutankhamun, meaning the living image of the Aten, a name that firmly and unmistakably situated him, from his very earliest days of life, within his father's distinctive religious world, and one that stands in notable and telling contrast to the name history would eventually come to know him by, a name he would only adopt later. Following a further transformation in Egyptian religious life that falls beyond the scope of this particular account. Of the infancy of Tutankhamun, direct historical evidence is scarce indeed, and much of what can reasonably be said relies on careful inference drawn from the broader circumstances of royal childhood during this general period, combined with more recent archaeological and scientific findings related specifically to his own preserved remains. Modern medical and genetic examination of his mummy has revealed indications of physical fragility present from an early age, including evidence of a cleft palate and a club foot, along with signs of recurring illness across his life, findings that, while pertaining most directly to his later years, suggest a childhood that may well have required particular care and close attention from those responsible for raising him. Though this documentary does not attempt to draw firm conclusions about his health or eventual death, matters that belong properly to a later and different part of his story. as a royal child born within Akhenaten's court, likely at Akhenaten itself during the very height of the Aten Revolution. Tutankhamun would have spent his earliest years within a household still fully and completely devoted to his father's sweeping religious transformation, surrounded constantly by the imagery of the sun disk, its rays extending in perpetual blessing over the royal family. An environment that stood as the dominant and unquestioned reality of his young life, whatever beliefs he would personally come to hold in the very different circumstances of his later years. Egyptian royal children of this era, though far removed in material circumstance from the lives of ordinary Egyptians living along the riverbanks, were nonetheless raised according to established customs surrounding infancy and early childhood that applied broadly across Egyptian society as a whole, including practices of breastfeeding often extended for several years. The use of protective amulets believed sincerely to ward off illness, misfortune, and malevolent supernatural forces, and the involvement of physicians and magico-medical practitioners whose remedies combined genuine empirical medical knowledge, developed over centuries of practice, with religious incantation and ritual, reflecting the Egyptians' broader and deeply held understanding of health as something bound up inseparably with both physical and spiritual well-being. As Tutankhamun grew gradually from infancy into early childhood, he would have entered a more structured and deliberate phase of upbringing typical of royal princes in this period, though direct sources documenting his own particular education have not survived to the present day, requiring historians to draw instead upon the broader body of evidence concerning the education of Egyptian princes more generally across this era. Royal children of this period were typically raised within a designated section of the palace, or in specially built royal nurseries, often in close and constant proximity to the children of high-ranking officials and courtiers, who were frequently raised alongside princes and princesses as personal companions and playmates from earliest childhood. A well-attested practice believed to foster deep loyalty and lasting personal bonds that would later serve the young prince well when he came, eventually and unexpectedly, to rely upon these very same childhood companions as trusted adult officials and advisors during his reign. Royal tutors, often drawn from the ranks of trusted senior officials, and sometimes bearing the specific formal title of tutor to a prince, oversaw not only formal academic instruction, but the broader moral and practical education expected of any member of the royal household, imparting careful lessons in comportment, religious duty, and the ancient traditions of kingship alongside more technical and practical instruction. It is likely that among the prince's earliest and closest attendants were individuals who would later rise to considerable prominence once their young charge unexpectedly ascended the throne, since Egyptian court culture placed enormous value on continuity of service and personal loyalty carefully built up over many years, a pattern well attested among the trusted officials who surrounded other child or unusually young pharaohs elsewhere in Egyptian history. Formal education for a royal prince destined for eventual influence, even one not originally raised with absolute certainty that he would one day inherit the throne itself, would have included careful instruction in hieroglyphic writing under the close supervision of professional scribes, a skill considered essential to royal and administrative authority throughout Egyptian civilization. Though it should be noted that Egyptian pharaohs themselves often relied heavily on professional scribes for the practical, day-to-day administration of government, even when they personally possessed some meaningful degree of literacy. Beyond writing, royal education is understood by historians to have encompassed thorough religious instruction appropriate to a prince who might one day bear responsibility for maintaining Maat and performing the many ritual duties incumbent upon an Egyptian king, alongside rigorous physical training considered essential to royal masculinity and effective leadership, including careful instruction in archery, horsemanship, and the skilled handling of chariots, disciplines in which several of Tutankhamun's contemporaries and immediate royal predecessors were depicted with particular artistic emphasis in surviving royal art and objects recovered from his own later burial, including numerous bows, arrows, and elaborately decorated chariots, strongly suggest that he too received careful training in these traditionally kingly and martial pursuits, regardless of whether he was ever actually able to employ them in the more overtly martial contexts so proudly celebrated in the art of Earlier warrior pharaohs. Daily life for a young prince within the royal court of Akhenaten would have unfolded amid truly extraordinary luxury, entirely removed from the hardship and physical labor faced by the vast majority of the wider Egyptian population. Royal apartments were adorned with painted floors and walls depicting rich scenes of the natural world, pools teeming with darting fish and waterfowl in flight, marshes thick with papyrus reeds swaying in the breeze, and gardens filled with climbing vines and heavily laden fruit trees. Motifs recovered through careful archaeological excavation at royal residences of this period that offer a vivid and immediate glimpse into the aesthetic world surrounding a child of the royal household. Furniture found in elite and royal contexts from this era, including later objects recovered from Tutankhamun's own eventual burial, indicates a material culture of truly extraordinary craftsmanship. Chairs and beds inlaid with ivory, gold leaf, and colored glass and semi-precious stone, ornate chests decorated with intricate painted and carved scenes, and games such as Senet, a board game enjoyed across every level of Egyptian society but rendered, in royal contexts, with materials of considerable and conspicuous luxury. Clothing for a royal child of this era would have been fashioned from the finest linen Egypt produced, carefully pleated, and in some cases dyed in subtle colors, a fabric perfectly suited to Egypt's hot and often unforgiving climate, and royal children, particularly in the more informal and strikingly naturalistic artistic style that flourished during Akhenaten's reign, are frequently depicted with the side lock of youth, a single lock of hair left long and carefully braided while the remainder of the head was shaved smooth or closely cropped, a widely attested marker of childhood found across Egyptian society regardless of social class or family wealth, along with jewelry appropriate to royal status, including elaborate collars, bracelets, and protective amulets intended both for personal adornment and for genuine magical protection against illness and misfortune. Entertainment within the royal household included music, provided by skilled court musicians playing instruments such as harps, lutes, flutes, and various forms of percussion, along with elaborate dancing performed for royal audiences during banquets and religious festivals, and the keeping of animals for both practical and ceremonial purposes, with royal hunting expeditions into the desert margins surrounding the fertile Nile Valley providing valuable training in horsemanship and archery. Alongside genuine recreation and sport, activities in which a young prince would likely have been gradually and carefully introduced as he grew older, even if full and unsupervised participation awaited later adolescence and physical maturity. The prince would have been surrounded from the very moment of his birth by an extensive retinue of servants and personal attendants responsible for every conceivable aspect of daily royal life, from nursemaids and wet nurses during infancy to body servants, hairdressers, and sandal bearers as he grew older, along with dedicated tutors responsible for his ongoing education and, in time, senior officials whose specific task it would be to prepare him, whatever his original position in the line of succession may have been understood to be, for the genuine possibility of eventual royal responsibility. Chief among the expectations placed upon any Egyptian prince who might one day inherit the throne was the deeply held understanding that he would eventually be required to maintain Ma'at, to honor the gods through proper and consistent ritual observance, whichever gods those might ultimately prove to be, to ensure the continued prosperity and physical security of Egypt as a whole, and to preserve carefully the legacy and monuments left behind by his royal ancestors. For a child born into the specific and highly unusual circumstances of Akhenaten's court, however, these traditional royal expectations existed alongside an additional and genuinely unusual dimension: the responsibility, at least as his father would certainly have understood and insisted upon it, of continuing steadfast devotion to the Aten and to the singular religious vision that his father had so forcefully imposed upon the entire kingdom, a vision whose long-term stability, even as the young prince himself was still growing through the ordinary stages of childhood, was becoming increasingly and visibly uncertain with each passing year. The final years of Akhenaten's reign remain among the most obscure, fragmentary, and genuinely contested periods in the entire recorded history of ancient Egypt, a span of time during which the surviving historical record grows notably thin, at times contradictory, and generally difficult to reconstruct with real confidence, leaving historians to piece together a plausible sequence of events from damaged inscriptions, defaced monuments, and the physical evidence of royal burials whose occupants are not always clearly or reliably identified. What can be said with reasonable scholarly confidence is that, in the later years of his rule, Akhenaten's grip upon a kingdom already strained severely by more than a decade of religious upheaval seems to have grown increasingly precarious, compounded by a painful succession of personal losses within his own immediate family. Inscriptional evidence suggests that at least two of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughters died during this difficult period, and some scholars have proposed, based on the timing and circumstances suggested by the surviving evidence, that Egypt may have been afflicted during these very years by a widespread epidemic, quite possibly a form of plague, that swept through the wider region of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, a hypothesis supported in part by scattered references to widespread illness found in diplomatic correspondence from neighboring kingdoms during roughly this same period. Though the precise nature, ultimate origin, and full extent of any such epidemic within Egypt itself remains a matter of ongoing scholarly investigation rather than settled end. Nefertiti herself disappears almost entirely from the historical record during these final and increasingly troubled years of Akhenaten's reign, her ultimate fate a subject of extensive and unresolved scholarly debate rather than established historical fact. Some historians propose that she simply died during this period, her death contributing directly to the mounting atmosphere of crisis and personal loss surrounding the royal family in Akhenaten's final years. Others suggest she may not have died at all, but instead was elevated to a genuine co-regency alongside Akhenaten under an entirely new royal throne name, effectively continuing to rule at his side, or perhaps even succeeding him directly in her own right, under an identity that modern scholars have found genuinely difficult to disentangle with confidence from other figures known to have held power during this brief and chaotic transitional period, most notably a ruler called Smenkhare, whose own historical identity, gender, and precise relationship to the wider royal family remain among the more actively and passionately debated puzzles of the entire era. This documentary does not attempt to resolve this particular debate, which remains genuinely unsettled among specialists in the field, but presents it here as a clear illustration of just how fragmentary, incomplete, and contested the surviving evidence for this pivotal period truly is. What is more firmly and confidently established is that Akhenaten's own death, whenever precisely it occurred, brought his singular and uncompromising religious vision to an uncertain and genuinely unstable crossroads. The years immediately following his death saw the brief reign of at least one, and by some scholarly reconstructions possibly as many as two, shadowy successors, most prominently the aforementioned Smenkhare, whose rule appears to have lasted no more than a year or two at most, and about whom almost nothing can be said with real certainty beyond the barest outline suggested by surviving inscriptions and burial evidence. Whether Smenkhare represented an entirely separate individual, perhaps an otherwise unattested son or brother of Akhenaten known from no other source, or was in fact an alternate royal identity adopted by Nefertiti herself during this period of crisis, remains genuinely unresolved, and some scholars have proposed still other reconstructions entirely, reflecting the truly fragmentary nature of the surviving record for this brief, chaotic, and consequential transitional period in Egyptian history. For ordinary Egyptians living through this final, unsettled phase of Akhenaten's reign, whatever their private beliefs regarding the old gods and the new religion imposed from above, this atmosphere of royal death, disputed succession, and mounting administrative uncertainty at the very summit of the state would have translated into genuine and widespread anxiety. For the stability of the Egyptian state and the well-being of its entire population were understood at every level of society, from the palace down to the smallest village, to depend directly upon the security of the throne and the proper, uninterrupted performance of kingship. A land whose harvests, whose protection from foreign threat, and whose very cosmic order were believed to rest ultimately upon the person of a legitimate and capable pharaoh could not easily absorb repeated uncertainty over who precisely held that sacred office, nor could it easily absorb the unsettling prospect that the office itself might soon fall, by default and by tragic necessity, to a child not yet 10 years of age. It was amid this atmosphere of religious upheaval, royal deaths, uncertain succession, and a kingdom whose traditional temples had stood diminished and largely neglected for more than a decade, that it fell to a child, likely no more than 9 years of age, the young Tutankhaten, to inherit the throne of Egypt. He was, by this point, one of the very few surviving members of the immediate royal family with any plausible remaining claim to succession, and whatever the precise sequence of deaths and brief reigns that preceded his own accession, the underlying reality confronting Egypt was unmistakable. An empire that had, only a single generation earlier, stood at the very height of its wealth and international power, now found its sacred throne occupied by a child, inheriting a kingdom fractured by religious revolution, its traditional priesthoods diminished and resentful, its royal family decimated by death and prolonged uncertainty, and its entire future entirely dependent upon the guidance, wisdom, and personal ambitions of the powerful adults who would inevitably surround him. The coronation of an Egyptian king was among the most sacred, elaborate, and carefully choreographed ceremonies performed within the entire framework of Egyptian religious and political life, a ritual understood not merely as a political transfer of administrative authority, but as a moment of profound and genuine cosmic significance, in which a mortal child was transformed, through sacred rite and ancient formula, into the living embodiment of divine kingship itself. While no single surviving inscription describes the precise coronation of the boy king in fully exhaustive detail, Egyptologists have carefully reconstructed the likely form and sequence of the ceremony from the broader body of evidence concerning royal coronation ritual in this general period, including temple reliefs, formal inscriptions, and later commemorative texts referring back to the event with reverence. The ceremony would very likely have taken place at Thebes, quite possibly at the great temple complex of Karnak itself or at nearby Luxor, a deeply symbolic choice given the temple's ancient association with Ammonius and the entire traditional Egyptian pantheon. Whatever complicated and fraught religious legacy the young king had inherited directly from his father, priests would have ritually purified the young king through careful and repeated ceremonial washing, believed sincerely to cleanse him symbolically and spiritually before he could be properly presented before the assembled gods. He would have been dressed in the full and elaborate regalia of kingship, the shindet kilt, pleated and gleaming brilliant white, the striped Nemes headcloth falling in careful folds across his young shoulders, and in time the imposing double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt with the red crown of Lower Egypt, symbolizing visually his rule over the entire unified kingdom, along with the crook and flail, ancient and instantly recognizable symbols of kingly authority reaching back many centuries to the earliest periods of Egyptian civilization, representing the pharaoh's sacred role as shepherd and provider for his entire people. The coronation would have included the solemn recitation of sacred formulae proclaiming the young king's undoubted divine legitimacy, his personal identification with the god Horus, and his formal adoption of the elaborate series of royal names and titles that traditionally accompanied every Egyptian pharaoh's accession, names proclaiming him as beloved of particular gods, as the strong bull, as lord of the two lands. Formulaic titles rich with layered symbolic and religious meaning that bound the new king firmly and permanently to the long, unbroken chain of legitimate kingship stretching back to the legendary unification of Egypt at the very dawn of its recorded history. Officials, priests, and members of the assembled court would have gathered in considerable numbers to witness this solemn ceremony, and it is likely that generous offerings were made to the gods, that fragrant incense was burned in great quantities, and that hymns were sung invoking divine blessings upon the reign that was now formally beginning. For a child of only 9 years, however carefully rehearsed and steadily supported by attendants and senior officials at every single step, the sheer weight of such a ceremony, conducted before the assembled elite of Egyptian society and invoking the full accumulated solemnity of thousands of years of unbroken religious tradition, must have been an experience of overwhelming and genuinely unforgettable gravity. Beyond the temple walls, word of the new king's coronation would have spread outward along the Nile through the ordinary and well-established channels of Egyptian communication, carried by traveling officials, merchants, and messengers moving between towns and provincial administrative centers, eventually reaching farmers laboring in their fields and craftsmen working in their small workshops as news of a fresh rain, and with it, for a great many ordinary Egyptians, a cautious and perhaps desperately needed hope that a young king, however inexperienced and however young in years, might yet bring an end to the prolonged uncertainty of recent years, restore genuine stability to a fractured religious and administrative order, and renew the fundamental security that Egyptians across every level of society had long understood their collective prosperity to depend upon absolutely. Yet however magnificent the outward ceremony, and however genuine the popular hope it may have inspired, the underlying political reality was entirely unavoidable. Actual, day-to-day governance of Egypt could not realistically rest in the hands of a child not yet 10 years old, however divine his newly proclaimed status. From the very outset of his reign, the young king depended entirely and completely upon the guidance, protection, and, in practical terms, the direct authority of the powerful adults who now surrounded his throne, men and, quite possibly, women whose own personal ambitions and careful political calculations would shape the actual direction of Egypt every bit as much as, if not considerably more than, the private wishes of the boy who now formally bore its crown. Central among those who now surrounded the young king was his wife, Ankhesenamun, the third daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and therefore, in all likelihood, his own half-sister, a marriage that, however striking to modern sensibilities, reflected precisely the same royal preference for close-kin marriage already discussed in relation to the boy king's own contested parentage, understood by the Egyptians of this era as a legitimate and time-honored means of preserving the sanctity and unbroken concentration of royal blood. Ankhesenamun was several years older than her young husband at the time of their marriage, and she had, remarkably, already lived through a considerable amount by the time that marriage took place, having appeared already in earlier surviving art from her father's reign as a young child accompanying her parents, and having been, according to some scholarly interpretations of the surviving evidence, previously married to her own father Akhenaten during the final years of his reign, a practice not entirely without precedent among Egyptian royalty of this particular era. Before that earlier union, whatever its true nature and duration may have been, ended decisively with Akhenaten's death. The marriage between the boy king and Ankhesenamun would have carried enormous political and religious significance, well beyond simple personal or family considerations. As a direct daughter of both Akhenaten and Nefertiti, Ankhesenamun's own unimpeachable royal blood served to reinforce and firmly legitimize her young husband's claim to the throne, particularly given the lingering uncertainties surrounding his own parentage and the broader dynastic instability that had characterized the succession in the immediately preceding years. Surviving artistic representations from early in the young couple's married life, most notably a small and exquisitely crafted gilded throne recovered many centuries later from his own burial, depict the young king and his wife together in a scene of striking personal intimacy, rendered in the naturalistic artistic style directly inherited from his father's revolutionary reign. The queen gently anointing her husband with perfumed oil beneath the life-giving rays of the Aten, its small hands, extending downward in continued blessing, a powerful visual testament to the religious world both had been born into and had, at least at this early point in the young king's reign, continued faithfully to inhabit together. Whatever genuine affection may have existed between them, and the surviving art certainly suggests a real and touching tenderness in their artistic depiction together, the marriage was also, quite unmistakably, a serious and calculated political institution, binding together the remaining legitimate royal bloodline at a moment of considerable dynastic fragility and uncertainty, and ensuring that whatever children the young couple might eventually produce would carry an unimpeachable and unchallenged claim to the throne of Egypt, a hope that, as later evidence would eventually reveal, was tragically never to be fully realized, a matter that lies, however, entirely beyond the scope of what this particular account will address. Beyond his young queen, two towering figures loom especially large over the very beginning of the boy king's reign, men whose long careers had already been forged in the turbulent religious and political environment of Akhenaten's court, and whose combined influence over the new king would prove genuinely decisive in the uncertain years that lay immediately ahead. The first of these was I, a senior and experienced official who had served prominently throughout Akhenaten's reign and who bore the significant and unusual title God's Father, a designation whose precise meaning remains genuinely debated among historians, with some suggesting it indicated a direct familial relationship to the royal family, possibly as father of Nefertiti herself, a proposal supported by a modest body of circumstantial evidence, though not confirmed entirely beyond scholarly dispute, while others interpret the title in a more purely honorific or religious sense without necessarily implying any direct blood relation to the throne itself. Whatever its precise significance, I held a position of extraordinary and unmistakable influence at court by the time of the young king's accession, likely serving in a role approximating that of chief advisor or informal regent, quietly guiding policy and administration on behalf of a monarch far too young to govern independently in any meaningful sense. Surviving artistic and inscriptional evidence, including objects closely associated with the young king's own burial, indicate that I occupied a position of sustained trust and considerable prominence throughout the boy king's entire reign, positioning him, by virtue of both long experience and close physical proximity to the throne, as arguably the single most powerful civilian figure in all of Egypt at the very outset of this new and uncertain reign. The second figure of comparable significance was Horemheb, a man of apparently non-royal origin who had risen steadily through the ranks of the Egyptian military and civil administration to become commander of the army and deputy of the king, a position placing him in direct and unchallenged control of Egypt's entire armed forces at a moment when the kingdom's internal stability and international prestige alike depended heavily upon genuine military strength and constant readiness. Horemheb's own surviving inscriptions from this period reveal a man deeply and personally concerned with the restoration of order and traditional administrative efficiency following the many disruptions of the preceding religious revolution, and his powerful combination of military authority and broader administrative influence made him an entirely indispensable figure at court, one whose support, or conversely whose active opposition, could genuinely make or unmake royal policy regardless of the young king's own personal wishes in the matter. Together, I and Horemheb represented the two towering pillars upon which the boy king's early and uncertain reign would necessarily rest, one commanding the vast machinery of civil administration and religious affairs, the other commanding directly the unwavering loyalty of Egypt's entire army, and both men, whatever their own private ambitions may genuinely have been, understood with total and unmistakable clarity that the child now seated upon the throne of Egypt required their constant guidance, their careful protection, and, inevitably, their firm direction, in order to govern successfully a kingdom still reeling visibly from more than a decade of sustained religious upheaval, severely disrupted temple economies, an unusually disrupted royal succession, and an uncertain international standing among Egypt's rivals and allies alike. Whether these two powerful men acted, in these earliest and most fragile years, as genuinely loyal servants committed sincerely to restoring lasting stability on behalf of their young king, or as ambitious and calculating figures maneuvering carefully to secure and steadily expand their own personal influence over a throne occupied by a child far too young to resist them in any practical sense, remains a question that historians continue to weigh and debate even today, and one that the years of the boy king's reign that followed would answer only gradually, and even then only in part. As the boy who had been born to Tutankhamun took his uncertain place upon the ancient throne of Egypt, the kingdom he now nominally ruled stood at a genuine and consequential crossroads. Behind him lay more than a decade of sweeping religious revolution, a fractured and resentful priesthood, an abandoned capital rising improbably from the desert sands, and a royal family visibly diminished by repeated death and prolonged uncertainty. Before him lay a multitude of unanswered and genuinely pressing questions upon which the future fate of Egypt itself now seemed to rest. Would the traditional gods, driven forcibly from their ancient temples and stripped of their long-honored place at the center of Egyptian religious life, ever be restored to their former position of unquestioned authority? Or would the singular vision his father had so forcefully imposed upon the kingdom somehow endure and take permanent root? Would the diminished treasuries and severely disrupted economies of the old temple networks eventually recover their former strength? Or would this dramatic transformation prove permanent and irreversible? And at the very center of it all stood the boy himself, a child of perhaps 9 years, now crowned with the full and awesome weight of pharaonic authority, yet entirely and completely dependent upon the powerful men who now stood immediately at his side. Whether he would grow, in time, to become a genuine ruler in his own right, capable of shaping the future destiny of Egypt according to his own mature judgment, or whether he would remain, for the whole of what might prove to be a brief reign, a mere child king guided, and perhaps quietly and thoroughly governed, by the practiced and powerful hands of Ai and Hormheb, was a question that not even the priests who had just crowned him, nor the assembled officials who now knelt respectfully before him, could yet answer with any real or lasting certainty. The boy who now bore the crown of Egypt woke each morning to a weight that few children in human history have ever been asked to carry. He was king in name from the very moment the double crown had been placed upon his head, addressed by titles that proclaimed him beloved of the gods, strong bull, lord of the two lands. Yet he possessed neither the years nor the experience to translate those titles into the actual governance of an empire still reeling from more than a decade of religious upheaval. The responsibilities that now rested upon him were not abstract. Egypt required a king who could be seen to perform the correct rituals at the correct moments, who could receive foreign envoys with appropriate dignity, who could be presented to his own people as the living guarantor of Maat, the cosmic balance upon which the Egyptians believed their prosperity depended entirely. That such a figure was, in reality, a child not yet 10 years old, dependent upon the men who stood at his side for every meaningful decision of state, was a contradiction the Egyptian court would spend the whole of his reign attempting, with considerable success, to manage and to conceal behind the reassuring theater of royal ceremony. Egyptian political culture possessed, in this respect, a genuine advantage over many later systems of monarchy, since the ideology of divine kingship did not require the king to personally devise policy so much as to embody, through ritual and presence, the sacred office itself, allowing experienced officials to exercise the practical business of governance, while the young king fulfilled the ceremonial and religious functions that Egyptian belief considered essential to the kingdom's well-being. The political challenges inherited from Akhenaten's reign extended well beyond the person of the king himself. Akhenaten's religious revolution had, for more than a decade, redirected the wealth, labor, and administrative attention of the Egyptian state away from the traditional temples and toward a single new capital built from nothing in the desert. Whatever the sincerity of that revolution's religious convictions, its practical consequences were now plainly visible across the kingdom. Diminished temple economies, a priesthood of Ammonius stripped of much of its former wealth and purpose, provincial cult centers left without royal patronage, and an administrative class that had, in many cases, uprooted itself from ancestral homes and traditions to serve a god whose long-term future now appeared, following Akhenaten's death and the brief and poorly documented reigns that followed it, genuinely uncertain. Egypt's international standing, too, showed signs of strain. The Amarna letters, that remarkable archive of diplomatic correspondence preserved by chance in the abandoned capital's ruins, reveal foreign vassal rulers in the Levant pleading with increasing urgency for Egyptian military support against rivals and raiders, appeals that appear to have gone unanswered with a frequency that would have been unthinkable during the confident, expansive decades of Amenhotep III's reign. Whether this reflected genuine neglect on Akhenaten's part, a deliberate reprioritization of resources toward the religious transformation at home, or simply the ordinary friction of managing a sprawling network of vassal states from a great distance, the cumulative impression left in the sources is of an empire whose grip on its frontiers had loosened during the years of religious revolution, a loosening the new reign would now have to address. It was against this backdrop of internal fracture and external strain that Ai and Hormheb assumed their positions at the center of government, and it is worth considering what their influence actually meant in practical terms for the day-to-day administration of Egypt. bearing decades of experience at court reaching back into the reigns of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten alike, appears to have functioned as the young king's principal civilian advisor, overseeing the machinery of administration, religious policy, and the countless decisions of protocol and precedent that a functioning royal court required on a daily basis. Horemheb, commanding the army and holding the title Deputy of the King, provided the military authority and disciplined administrative competence that a kingdom recovering from internal disruption urgently needed, and inscriptions from his own later career suggest a man deeply invested in restoring order, punishing corruption among officials, and reasserting the practical efficiency of government after years of upheaval. Together, these two men did not rule as regents in any formally proclaimed sense, since Egyptian ideology required that all authority flow visibly from the person of the king himself, but the surviving evidence leaves little doubt that major decisions of state during the earliest years of the reign bore their imprint as much as, or more than, that of the child in whose name those decisions were formally issued. Under this guidance, and very likely reflecting a broader consensus among the surviving court elite that Akhenaten's religious experiment had run its course and endangered the stability of the kingdom, the young king's reign became defined by a gradual but unmistakable reversal of his father's revolution. The abandonment of the Aten did not happen in a single decisive stroke. Rather, the evidence suggests a careful, deliberate unwinding, in which royal patronage was steadily redirected away from the sun disk and back toward the old gods, temple by temple and province by province, allowing the transition to unfold with a measure of order rather than the abruptness that had characterized Akhenaten's original revolution against Ammonius. Perhaps the single clearest public symbol of this reversal came early in the reign, when the boy king abandoned the name he had carried since birth, Tutankhamun, the living image of the Aten, and adopted in its place the name by which history would come to know him, Tutankhamun, the living image of Ammonius. The change was not a matter of personal preference so much as a deliberate and highly visible declaration of policy, broadcast through royal inscription to every corner of the kingdom. The old gods, and Ammonius above all, were being restored to their rightful place at the center of Egyptian religious life, and the young king's own name would now proclaim that restoration each time it was spoken or inscribed. His queen, Ankhesenamun, underwent the same symbolic transformation, becoming Ankhesenamun, her name likewise rewritten to honor the god her own father had spent a reign attempting to erase. The restoration that followed was neither instantaneous nor, in all likelihood, entirely the initiative of a child still years away from adulthood, but it proceeded with evident purpose across the early years of the reign. Temples that had stood diminished, their doors closed to regular worship and their priesthoods reduced to a fraction of their former numbers, were reopened by royal decree. A lengthy inscription known to modern historians as the Restoration Stela, erected at Karnak in the young king's name, describes in vivid and deliberately dramatic language the condition into which Egypt's temples had fallen during the preceding years, their shrines abandoned, their sacred images neglected, their priesthoods scattered, and the land itself, according to the stela's own theological framing, suffering as a consequence of the god's displeasure at having been forsaken. The inscription proclaims that the young king undertook to restore what had been broken, to refurbish the images of the gods in gold and precious stone, to reinstate priesthoods, and to reestablish the offerings and rituals that maintained the proper relationship between Egypt and its divine patrons. Modern historians read this document with appropriate caution, recognizing it as a work of royal propaganda composed to legitimize the new regime as much as a literal historical record. Yet its broad outline of a court actively and deliberately reversing the religious policies of the preceding decade is corroborated by the archaeological evidence of renewed temple construction and restoration activity dated to this period. The return of Ammonius to preeminence did not mean the wholesale destruction of the Aten's cult, at least not immediately. Evidence suggests a more gradual process, in which traditional worship was reinstated and heavily favored while the Aten was permitted, for a time, to persist as one deity among the restored pantheon rather than being subjected to an immediate campaign of eradication comparable to the one Akhenaten had directed against Ammonius. The comprehensive erasure of Akhenaten's own memory and monuments, and the systematic dismantling of Akhenaten as a functioning capital, appears to have accelerated more fully under the reigns of Ai and, especially, Horemheb, once each had in turn succeeded to the throne in his own right. Developments that fall beyond the years of Tutankhamun's own reign and beyond the scope of what can be attributed directly to the boy king himself. Rebuilding Egypt's religious institutions required more than the mere reopening of temple doors. It demanded the restoration of the economic foundations upon which temple life depended. Farmland returned to temple ownership, herds of cattle reassigned, workshops reactivated, and, above all, the reappointment of priests to positions that had stood vacant or diminished for the better part of a decade. The Restoration stela speaks of the king appointing new personnel to serve the gods and endowing temples with fresh offerings of gold, silver, and precious materials, and while such claims must be read as the idealized language of royal self-presentation, the broader pattern of renewed temple activity attested in the archaeological record across this period suggests that the restoration was pursued with genuine resources and sustained royal attention, not merely proclaimed and then neglected. The priesthood itself, which had endured a decade of diminished status and disrupted income, appears to have reemerged from this period with its institutional confidence restored and, in time, its wealth and political influence greater than they had been even before Akhenaten's revolution began, a trajectory that would continue to shape Egyptian religious and political life for generations after the young king's own death. The role the priesthood played during these years of restoration was not merely passive. Senior priests, particularly those attached to the Temple of Ammonius at Karnak, appear to have worked closely with the royal court to identify which rites had lapsed, which sacred images required refurbishment, and which endowments of land and labor needed to be reinstated before temple life could resume its former rhythm. This collaboration between crown and priesthood, each dependent upon the other for legitimacy and resources, helped ensure that the restoration proceeded with a degree of coordination and institutional memory that a purely top-down royal decree could not, by itself, have achieved, and it laid the groundwork for a partnership between throne and temple that would grow, in the following decades, into one of the defining features of later New Kingdom government. For ordinary Egyptians, the religious reversal unfolding under the young king would have been experienced very differently, depending on where one stood in relation to the upheavals of the preceding years. In towns and villages where local temples had continued to function, however diminished, in the shadow of the new state religion, the restoration likely arrived as a welcome and long-awaited normalization, a return of familiar festivals, familiar gods, and familiar rhythms of religious life that had structured Egyptian existence for as long as anyone could remember. Farmers returning from the fields at the close of day could once again bring offerings to a local shrine whose priest had resumed his customary duties. Households that had quietly maintained small domestic altars to household deities such as Bes and Taret throughout the years of official Aten worship, a continuity suggested by archaeological finds from ordinary settlements even during the height of Akhenaten's reign, now found their private devotions once more aligned with the public religion of the state. For those who had relocated to Akhenaten, built careers around service to the Aten, or invested their professional identities in the new order Akhenaten had constructed, the restoration meant displacement and, in many cases, a difficult process of reintegration into a religious and administrative landscape that had shifted decisively beneath them. The abandonment of Akhenaten itself, though it appears to have proceeded gradually rather than through any single dramatic evacuation, would have been felt keenly by the officials, craftsmen, and laborers whose lives had been built around that city, as the center of gravity of Egyptian political and religious life shifted back toward Thebes and Memphis, leaving the desert capital to the slow encroachment of sand and disrepair. Beyond the specifically religious sphere, evidence for broader administrative reform during Tutankhamun's reign remains more limited, though the restoration stela itself functions as a kind of administrative as well as religious document, announcing the reappointment of officials and the re-establishment of proper governance following a period the inscription characterizes, in suitably dramatic terms, as one of disorder and divine displeasure. Some historians see in these years an effort to rebuild the trust and competence of Egypt's civil administration more broadly, a project consistent with what is known of Horemheb's own later priorities as king, when he would issue a lengthy edict addressing corruption among officials and reforming aspects of the legal and administrative system, though the extent to which such reforms had already begun under the boy king, as opposed to being initiated only after Horemheb's own accession, remains difficult to establish with precision from the surviving evidence. Egypt's diplomatic situation with neighboring kingdoms during this period shows signs of careful, deliberate repair. The vigorous outward-facing diplomacy that had characterized Amenhotep III's reign, and which appears to have weakened during the years of religious revolution and internal focus under Akhenaten, seems to have received renewed attention, with diplomatic gifts, correspondence, and the traditional apparatus of Egyptian international relations resuming a more active character. The great powers of the day, including the kingdoms of Mitanni, Babylon, and the rapidly ascending Hittite Empire in Anatolia, continued to watch Egyptian affairs closely, aware that a young and dependent king, however carefully managed by his advisors, represented a period of relative vulnerability in Egypt's otherwise formidable international standing. The Hittites in particular had, in recent decades, expanded their own influence steadily southward into territories long considered within Egypt's sphere, absorbing the once powerful kingdom of Mitanni and pressing against the northern edges of Egyptian-controlled Syria, a shifting balance of power that would have made the stability or instability of the Egyptian throne a matter of considerable interest to observers in the Hittite capital. Objects recovered in later years from the young king's own tomb, including items of foreign manufacture and materials sourced from beyond Egypt's borders, attest to the continuation of international trade and exchange throughout the reign, even if the full details of specific diplomatic exchanges during these particular years remain only partially documented in the surviving textual record. Regarding military affairs during Tutankhamun's reign, the evidence must be approached with particular caution, since later royal monuments, and in some cases the artistic conventions of Egyptian kingship itself, tend to attribute military triumphs to a pharaoh as a matter of ideological expectation regardless of his actual personal participation in warfare. Painted scenes on a small ornamental chest, recovered many centuries later, depict the king in the traditional pose of a triumphant warrior, riding a chariot into battle against Nubian and Asiatic enemies, smiting his foes in a manner that closely follows a long-established artistic template used to depict Egyptian kings as conquerors regardless of the historical reality of any specific campaign. Some historians take these images as reflecting genuine, if perhaps limited, military engagements conducted on the king's behalf by his generals, quite possibly including Horemheb himself, in Nubia or the Levant during these years, a plausible scenario given Egypt's ongoing need to maintain its frontiers and vassal relationships. Others regard the imagery as largely or entirely conventional, a required element of royal artistic self-presentation rather than a record of specific historical events, noting that no independent textual evidence of a major campaign, personally led or even meaningfully overseen by the young king himself, has survived. What can be said with confidence is that the king, given his age throughout the whole of his reign, is exceedingly unlikely to have taken any direct personal role in battlefield combat. Whatever military activity may or may not have been carried out in his name by the professional commanders who served him. Behind these matters of religion, administration, and diplomacy, the young king continued to grow from childhood into adolescence within a royal court whose daily rhythms combined the ordinary business of governance with an unceasing calendar of ceremony and ritual observance. Palace life during these years unfolded primarily at Memphis and Thebes, the two great administrative and religious centers between which the Egyptian court traditionally moved, with royal residences at each city serving as the backdrop for a life structured around religious festivals, diplomatic audiences, and the countless smaller rituals that punctuated an Egyptian king's day from the moment of his waking to the moment he retired each evening. Each morning is believed to have begun with rites of ritual purification, followed by the king's toilet, an elaborate and highly formalized ceremony in which the king was dressed, adorned with jewelry, and prepared for the day's public appearances by attendants whose specific roles, from sandal-bearer to keeper of the royal wardrobe, were themselves considered offices of some prestige within the court hierarchy. Religious festivals structured the calendar of the reign in ways that connected the young king directly to the restored gods, whose favor his own name now proclaimed. The Great Festival of Opet, in which the sacred image of Ammonius was carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor amid celebration and public feasting, would have taken on particular symbolic weight during a reign so publicly dedicated to that god's restoration, offering the population of Thebes a vivid and joyous demonstration that the old order had indeed returned. Crowds gathered along the processional route between the two great temples, drawn by music, dancing, and the free distribution of bread and beer that traditionally accompanied such festivals, an occasion on which the abstract theology of royal restoration became something ordinary Thebans could see, hear, and taste for themselves. Other festivals, tied to the agricultural calendar and the rhythms of the Nile's flooding, continued to punctuate the year as they had for centuries, providing ordinary Egyptians with occasions for communal celebration even as the great political dramas of restoration played out largely beyond their direct experience or comprehension. Hunting remained a favored pursuit of Egyptian kingship, both as genuine recreation and as a ritual demonstration of the pharaoh's strength and mastery over the forces of chaos represented by wild and dangerous animals. The desert margins beyond the cultivated floodplain, home to lions, wild bulls, ostriches, and antelope, provided the traditional stage for such pursuits, the king setting out from the palace in a chariot accompanied by attendants, hunting dogs, and the equipment of the hunt, a spectacle that combined the practical thrill of the chase with a deeper symbolic resonance, since the desert itself represented, in Egyptian cosmology, a realm of disorder held at bay by the king's ordered, cultivated kingdom along the river. Objects recovered in later years, including bows, arrows, and a remarkable painted chest depicting the king hunting lions and other game from a speeding chariot, suggest that Tutankhamun, as he grew older, participated in expeditions of this kind, activities that combined physical exercise, aristocratic sport, and religious symbolism in ways characteristic of Egyptian royal culture more broadly. Whether his own physical condition, a matter to which this account will soon turn in some detail, allowed him to participate as actively in such pursuits as the idealized artistic record suggests remains a matter that scholars continue to weigh carefully against the physical evidence of his remains. Education, too, continued to shape the young king's development throughout his reign, since the formal instruction begun in childhood did not cease simply because he had already been crowned. Egyptian kingship, whatever the practical realities of power exercised by advisors, still required a ruler capable of participating knowledgeably in religious ritual, of appearing before foreign envoys with appropriate command of protocol, and of continuing to develop the physical and martial skills expected of an adult pharaoh as he approached that stage of life. Tutors and senior officials, quite possibly including men who had served him since early childhood, would have continued to guide his education in scribal literacy, religious knowledge, and the ceremonial expectations of his office, preparing him, however incompletely his brief life would allow, for the fuller exercise of independent rule that Egyptian tradition anticipated a king would eventually assume as he matured into adulthood. The material culture surrounding the king's daily life speaks to a court of continued and even intensified luxury. Furniture of ebony, ivory, and gold leaf, linens of the finest weave, some pleated in the elaborate style favored by Egyptian royalty, jewelry incorporating gold, carnelian, lapis lazuli, and turquoise sourced from mines and trade networks spanning much of the ancient Near East, and cosmetic implements, including coal containers and unguent jars, all attest to a daily existence saturated with craftsmanship of the highest order. Clothing appropriate to his rank and to Egypt's warm climate consisted of fine pleated linen kilts and robes, often bleached to a brilliant white and sometimes dyed in subtle colors for ceremonial occasions, complemented by sandals of leather and gold, and jewelry worn as much for its protective, amuletic significance as for simple adornment. Entertainment within the royal household continued to include music performed on harps, lutes, and various forms of percussion, dancing during banquets and festivals, and the playing of board games such as Senet, rendered for royal use in materials of considerable luxury, offering the king and his household diversions appropriate to their station amid the more demanding obligations of ceremony and rule. The architecture of the royal palaces themselves, though less completely preserved than other elements of the period's material record, is known from archaeological remains to have featured painted floors and walls in the naturalistic style inherited from the Amarna period, alongside more traditional decorative programs celebrating the restored gods, suggesting a visual environment that blended the artistic innovations of the preceding decades with a renewed emphasis on established religious iconography. Religious rituals performed within these palaces, and within the temples the king now patronized with renewed enthusiasm, followed patterns of offering, purification, and recitation that had governed Egyptian worship for centuries, adapted only slightly to accommodate the particular circumstances of a young king still completing the education that would, in an ordinary reign of greater length, have prepared him more fully for these sacred responsibilities. Sustaining this life of ceremony and luxury required the labor of a vast supporting apparatus. Scribes who managed the administrative correspondence and economic records of the royal household, craftsmen in workshops producing furniture, jewelry, and ritual objects to standards of extraordinary refinement, and servants whose numbers, judging from what is known of comparable Egyptian royal courts, likely ran into the hundreds, encompassing every function from food preparation to personal attendance upon the king and queen. This entire apparatus, largely invisible in the more celebrated artistic and textual record of the reign, nonetheless made possible the world of ceremony, comfort, and religious restoration over which the young king nominally presided. Throughout these years, Ankhesenamun remained at the king's side, her own transformation from Ankhesenamun to a name honoring harmonious mirroring and reinforcing the broader religious restoration her husband's reign had come to represent. The artistic record of their marriage continues to depict a relationship of evident tenderness, the queen shown assisting her husband, handing him arrows during a hunting expedition, anointing him with oil, or simply seated companionably in his presence, images that, whatever their degree of idealization as royal art rather than literal documentary record, suggest a partnership that extended beyond the purely political necessity that had originally bound them together as children of the same contested royal generation. This marriage, as previously discussed in relation to his own contested parentage, followed the pattern of close-kin union favored by the Egyptian royal family of this era, since Ankhesenamun was very likely the king's own half-sister, both being children of Akhenaten, a familial closeness that Egyptian royal ideology treated as a legitimate means of preserving an unbroken and sacred royal bloodline. Evidence suggests the couple experienced at least one, and quite possibly two, pregnancies that ended before or shortly after birth, a profound personal loss that also carried grave political consequences, since it meant that the royal couple approached the later years of the reign without a surviving heir to secure the succession they had worked, through their very marriage, to stabilize. This absence of an heir would cast a long shadow over the uncertain events that followed the young king's death, a matter that lies beyond the boundaries of what can properly be addressed within the scope of his own reign. Yet its weight was surely felt within the palace long before that succession crisis fully unfolded, adding a note of personal sorrow to a marriage that, in its public presentation at least, had been offered to the kingdom as a symbol of renewed stability and continuity. Modern science has, in recent decades, transformed our understanding of the physical body behind the ceremony and the golden regalia, revealing a young man whose health appears to have been considerably more fragile than the idealized imagery of Egyptian royal art would ever have suggested. A series of radiological examinations, culminating in comprehensive computed tomography, or CT, scanning carried out in 2005, produced a detailed, three-dimensional record of the king's skeletal remains without requiring further disturbance of the fragile mummy itself. These scans revealed a young man who stood approximately 5 feet 6 inches in height, of generally slender build, and who had died at an age most researchers place between 18 and 20, based on the fusion patterns of his bones, though certainty within this range remains elusive given the inherent limitations of skeletal age estimation. Genetic analysis conducted alongside this radiological work examining DNA extracted from the king's remains and compared against those of several other royal mummies from this general period, confirmed the family relationships already discussed in relation to his contested parentage, identifying his likely father as the individual buried in tomb KV55, generally though not universally identified as Akhenaten, and his mother as a woman known only as the younger lady, herself a full sibling of that same father. This close-kin ancestry, historians and geneticists agree, considerably increased the likelihood that harmful recessive genetic traits would express themselves within the resulting offspring, a pattern consistent with the range of skeletal abnormalities the scans went on to reveal. Among the most significant of these findings was a left foot afflicted by a condition known as Koehler disease II, a degeneration of bone tissue in the foot that would have caused pain and almost certainly some degree of impaired mobility. This finding lends considerable weight to a discovery that had, for decades, puzzled those who studied the young king's burial. The presence, among his funerary equipment, of over 100 walking sticks and canes, some plain and functional, others elaborately decorated with gold and inlaid semi-precious stones. Earlier generations of Egyptologists had sometimes interpreted these objects as purely ceremonial regalia befitting royal status, since Egyptian kings were traditionally depicted holding staffs as symbols of authority regardless of their physical condition. But many specialists now regard at least a substantial portion of this collection as genuine mobility aids reflecting a real and persistent physical need, a conclusion supported by wear patterns observed on a number of the canes consistent with actual, repeated use rather than purely symbolic display. Additional scans identified a mild curvature of the spine and confirmed the presence of a cleft palate, congenital conditions that, taken together with the foot condition already described, have led a number of researchers to propose that the young king suffered from a constellation of health problems potentially linked to the close-kin marriage pattern documented within his immediate family across several generations. Genetic testing also identified evidence of malaria in his tissue, specifically a strain known to cause severe illness, present in his body at the time of death. Some researchers have proposed that a combination of chronic physical impairment, resulting in reduced mobility and general frailty, together with an acute malarial infection, may have combined to weaken him considerably in his final months, though this particular reconstruction, like nearly every theory concerning his health and eventual death, remains a matter of scholarly interpretation rather than settled and universally accepted fact. Beyond these broader indications of chronic ill health, the CT scans also revealed a significant fracture to the king's left thigh bone, or femur, an injury that appears, based on the absence of any healing observed in the bone tissue, to have been sustained shortly before his death, an injury serious enough that, in the absence of the antibiotics and modern surgical intervention that would treat such a fracture routinely today, it may plausibly have led to a severe infection setting into the wound, a genuinely dangerous, and in the ancient world potentially fatal, complication. Whether this fracture resulted from a fall, perhaps from a chariot during hunting or some other physical activity appropriate to a young king's expected pursuits, or from some other accident of a kind not recorded in any surviving source, has been a subject of careful debate among specialists, with the physical evidence permitting a plausible reconstruction without allowing definitive certainty. Over the course of the 20th century, before the advent of modern imaging and genetic technology, the cause of Tutankhamun's death attracted a wide range of theories, some grounded in careful observation of the available evidence, others reflecting the speculative enthusiasm that has long surrounded this particular king. An early and once popular theory, prompted by damage observed to the back of the mummy's skull, proposed that the young king had been murdered, struck a fatal blow to the head, perhaps as the victim of a palace conspiracy involving one or more of the powerful officials who surrounded his throne. This theory, while dramatically compelling and not entirely implausible given the genuine political stakes surrounding a young and heirless king, has been substantially undermined by subsequent CT scanning, which suggests that the skull damage in question is more consistent with the effects of the mummification process itself, or with handling during later examinations, than with a violent blow delivered before death, leading most current specialists to regard the murder theory as unlikely, though not, perhaps, entirely impossible to rule out with absolute finality given the limitations of the surviving evidence. More recent scholarship has tended to favor explanations rooted in the combination of chronic physical frailty and acute illness or injury already described, whether centered on the leg fracture and its potential complications, the malarial infection identified through genetic analysis, or some combination of these and other factors interacting within a body already weakened by congenital conditions and impaired mobility. What can be said with confidence, based on the convergence of the currently available skeletal, radiological, and genetic evidence, is that the young king's death most likely resulted not from a single dramatic act of violence, but from the interaction of chronic ill health, physical vulnerability, and an acute medical crisis of a kind that a young man in his physical condition would have been ill-equipped to survive, even with the considerable medical knowledge and care that Egyptian physicians, skilled as they were by the standards of their era, could bring to bear. The final months of the young king's reign cannot be reconstructed with the certainty that a definitive historical narrative would require, and any responsible account must acknowledge the limits of what the evidence allows. It is plausible, based on the physical evidence described above, that he experienced a period of declining health and mobility in his final year, relying with increasing frequency on the canes and walking sticks that would later be placed among his burial goods, his household growing quietly attentive to a young man whose vigor, so central to the ideology of Egyptian kingship, was visibly and perhaps troublingly diminished. Whether the malarial infection detected through genetic analysis represented a sudden and acute crisis in his final weeks, or a recurring affliction that had weakened him gradually over a longer period, remains impossible to establish with precision, though either scenario is consistent with the broader pattern of chronic frailty combined with acute illness that the physical evidence, taken as a whole, appears to describe. At some point, likely in his 19th or 20th year, whether through the sudden complication of his broken leg, the culmination of a long-standing illness, or some combination of factors that the surviving evidence cannot fully disentangle, Tutankhamun died. The precise date remains uncertain, though evidence drawn from the botanical materials placed within his tomb, including certain flowers whose blooming season is known with some confidence, has led some researchers to propose a death occurring in the earlier part of the calendar year, a proposal that remains suggestive rather than conclusively established. What can be said without hesitation is that his death, whenever it occurred, arrived far sooner than Egyptian expectation or preparation had anticipated, catching a court that had, in all likelihood, assumed a longer reign still lay ahead, and leaving behind an already fragile kingdom once again without a clear and uncontested path to the succession it required. News of the king's death would have traveled outward from the palace with the particular urgency that always accompanied the death of a pharaoh, an event understood by the Egyptians not merely as a personal or dynastic loss, but as a genuine disruption to the cosmic order that the king's living presence had been believed to maintain. Within the palace itself, and across the wider court at Memphis and Thebes, the immediate response would have combined genuine personal grief for a young man whose household had known him since childhood, with the more formal and ritualized expressions of mourning that Egyptian custom demanded of a court confronting the death of its sovereign. Ankhesenamun, still without a surviving heir and now suddenly widowed, faced not only private sorrow, but an immediate and pressing political crisis, since the future of the royal line she and her husband had worked to secure now hung in genuine and unresolved uncertainty. Word of the king's death would have spread outward from the court along the same channels that carried other royal news, reaching the towns and villages of the Nile Valley within days or weeks depending on distance, carried by officials, priests, and travelers moving along the river and its adjoining roads. Egyptian mourning customs upon the death of a king combined public lamentation with the immediate initiation of an elaborate and precisely regulated sequence of ritual preparation. Since Egyptian religious belief held that the proper treatment of the body and the correct performance of funerary ritual were essential to securing the deceased king's successful passage into the afterlife and his continued existence as a divine being among the gods. Professional mourners, women whose ritual role it was to display and lead public grief through wailing, the tearing of garments, and the scattering of dust upon their heads, would have accompanied the body during its formal procession to the embalmers, Their cries a familiar and expected feature of Egyptian funerary custom regardless of the deceased's rank, though performed with particular solemnity and scale when the deceased was the king himself. In the villages along the Nile, farmers and craftsmen who had never once glimpsed the young king in person, whose experience of his reign had consisted entirely of the taxes they paid, the festivals they attended, and the general sense of order or disorder that filtered down from a distant royal court, would nonetheless have felt the disruption of his death as a matter of genuine and immediate concern, since the security of the throne was understood, at every level of Egyptian society, to be bound up inextricably with the security of the harvest, the reliability of the Nile's flood, and the broader stability of a world the gods themselves were believed to govern through the person of a living king. Temples throughout the land, only recently reopened and restored to their traditional function through the very policies of the young king now being mourned, would have observed rites appropriate to the death of the pharaoh whose reign had returned them to prominence, an irony not lost, perhaps, on the priests who now offered prayers for the soul of the very king who had reinstated their offices. Across the kingdom, a period of official mourning is understood to have been observed, its precise duration for this particular king not recorded in any surviving source, but generally believed, based on the practices attested for other New Kingdom pharaohs, to have extended across much of the 70-day period required for mummification and the subsequent preparation of the burial. Behind the public rituals of mourning, a far more urgent and practical crisis was already unfolding within the highest levels of the Egyptian court. Egyptian kings traditionally began construction of their own tombs early in their reigns, anticipating a rule of considerable length and commissioning burial chambers, corridors, and decorative programs on a scale appropriate to a lifetime of preparation. Tutankhamun's death at such a young age, after a reign of perhaps only 9 or 10 years, appears to have caught the court without an adequately completed royal tomb ready to receive him, a circumstance that would demand urgent and difficult decisions from Hormheb, and the other senior officials now suddenly responsible for ensuring that their king received burial rites befitting his divine office, however compressed the available time had become. Workshops throughout Thebes and Memphis, staffed by craftsmen accustomed to producing objects of extraordinary quality but rarely under such pressing constraints of time, would have been mobilized to produce or adapt the furniture, jewelry, shrines, and countless other objects that Egyptian custom required a king to carry with him into the afterlife, a monumental undertaking that had, under ordinary circumstances, been expected to unfold across decades rather than mere weeks. Ankhesenamun, meanwhile, faced the added and deeply consequential burden of a succession left entirely unresolved by her husband's sudden death, a burden that would, in the weeks and months following his burial, draw her into a sequence of events whose full unfolding belongs to a period beyond her husband's own reign and beyond the boundaries of what this account will address. For the moment, her role, alongside and the priesthood now restored so recently to its former prominence, was to ensure that the young king who had presided over Egypt's return to its ancient gods would himself receive the full and sacred rites those same gods demanded of the dead. It was to the embalmers, then, that the king's body was ultimately entrusted, carried in solemn procession from the palace, across the river, to the specialized workshop on the western bank where the sacred and precisely regulated work of preservation would begin, a journey that itself echoed the sun god's own nightly passage from the world of the living into the realm of shadow, a symbolism the Egyptians understood intimately and invoked deliberately in the funerary rites of every king who had gone before him. There, under the guidance of priests trained in rites passed down across many centuries, rites whose precise sequence and sacred formulae had scarcely changed since the earliest dynasties of Egyptian civilization. The process that would determine whether the young king's body endured for eternity, exactly as Egyptian religious belief demanded it must, was set into motion. Instruments were prepared, natron gathered in the great quantities the process would require, and the priests who would oversee each stage of the work took up the masks of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, under whose divine authority this most sacred and irreversible of tasks was always, and only ever, performed. The first of the 70 days that separated a king's death from his final rest had begun, and behind the closed doors of the embalmer's workshop, The young king who had spent his brief reign restoring Egypt's gods to their rightful place now entered fully into their keeping, his body about to be transformed, through 70 days of ancient and exacting ritual, into the eternal form that would allow him, the Egyptians believed absolutely, to live again. In the low, cool chambers of the embalmer's workshop, the work that would determine how the young king was remembered for 3,000 years now began. The building itself stood apart from the settlements of the living, close enough to the river to receive the funerary barges, far enough to keep the impurity of death at a respectful distance. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of natron, resin, and burning incense, and the priests who moved through it wore the jackal mask of Anubis, god of embalming, so that it was not a mortal hand but the god himself who was believed to touch the king's body. The first task was purification. The body of Tutankhamun was washed in water drawn from the Nile and blended with natron, the naturally occurring salt that Egyptians had used for centuries to cleanse both the living and the dead. This was not merely hygienic, it was theological. The Nile's water was the water of creation itself, the substance from which the world had emerged in the beginning, and to wash the king's body in it was to return him, however briefly, to that first moment of existence, so that his rebirth into the afterlife could be modeled on the birth of the cosmos. Once cleansed, the body was laid upon an embalming table, likely a simple wooden bier tilted slightly so that fluids could drain away, with a stone or alabaster basin positioned beneath it. The priest performing the office of the Overseer of Mysteries, a title carried by the chief embalmer, oversaw a small team of specialists, each trained in a narrow and exacting craft. The cutter, whose task was the least honored despite being essential. The wrapper, whose skill would ultimately determine whether the body survived intact. And the lector priest, who read the sacred formulas aloud throughout, ensuring that no stage of the process proceeded without the accompaniment of the correct words. In Egyptian belief, ritual speech was not decoration. The spell and the action were inseparable. Without the words, the physical preservation of the body meant nothing, for it was the recitation that transformed a treated corpse into a vessel fit for eternity. The cutter's work came first and was performed with a blade of obsidian or flint, materials considered ritually purer than metal despite metal tools being available by this period. An incision was made along the left flank of the body, and through this opening the priests removed the organs of the abdominal cavity, the stomach, the liver, the lungs, and the intestines. Ancient tradition held that the priest who made this incision was ritually cursed the moment the blade touched the skin and was driven from the workshop by his colleagues, pelted with stones or curses, a ritualized act that displaced the violence of the cut onto a scapegoat and allowed the sacred work of preservation to proceed unburdened by guilt. It was a strange and telling detail of Egyptian religious psychology. The taking apart of the body was necessary, but it could not be allowed to appear as violence. It had to be reframed, instantly, as service. The heart alone was left in place, or in some cases removed and later returned to the body during wrapping. To the Egyptians, the heart was not simply an organ. It was the seat of thought, memory, conscience, and personal identity, the part of a person that would be called to account in the afterlife. In the great judgment described in the Book of the Dead, it was the heart that would be placed upon the scales of Maat, goddess of truth and cosmic order, to be weighed against the feather of truth itself. If the heart was heavier than the feather, laden with the guilt of a wrongful life, it would be devoured by the monstrous Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, and the deceased would cease to exist altogether, denied not punishment but obliteration. A king could not risk arriving at that judgment without his heart, and so it remained with him, or was restored to him, protected further by a heart scarab, an amulet in the shape of the sacred beetle inscribed with a spell instructing the heart not to testify against its owner, not to rise up in the moment of judgment and speak the truth of any hidden wrongdoing. It was a plea, carved in stone, asking silence from the one part of the self that could not lie. The brain, by contrast, was treated with something close to indifference, a fact that continues to surprise modern audiences accustomed to regarding the brain as the seat of the self. The Egyptians located intellect and personality in the heart, not the skull, and so the brain was considered largely superfluous to the journey ahead. It was removed through the nostril, using a long hooked instrument that was worked upward through the nasal cavity to break through the delicate bone at the base of the skull, after which the tissue was drawn out in fragments, or in some cases liquefied and allowed to drain. The empty cranial cavity might then be packed with resin-soaked linen, or in later periods with molten resin poured directly in to prevent the skull from collapsing during the drying process. The organs that had been removed were not discarded. Each was cleaned, treated with natron, and eventually placed within its own container, ultimately to rest inside 4 small coffins housed together in a canopic chest. These containers were protected by the 4 sons of Horus, minor but essential deities whose falcon-headed father Horus stood as the divine model for kingship itself. Each son assigned guardianship over 1 organ and 1 cardinal direction. Imsidi, shown with a human head, guarded the liver. Hapi, baboon-headed, guarded the lungs. Duamutef, jackal-headed, guarded the stomach. Kabesanof, falcon-headed, guarded the intestines. Each of these gods was in turn protected by a goddess. Isis watched over Imsidi, Nephthys over Hapi, Neith over Duamutef, and Serket over Kabesanof, so that every organ of the king's body was doubly secured by a divine guardian and a divine protector, layered protection that reflected the seriousness with which the Egyptians treated the idea that a body, to function in the afterlife, needed to be complete, its parts accounted for and safeguarded rather than lost to decay. With the cavity emptied, the true work of desiccation began, and it was this stage, more than any other, that consumed the majority of the 70 days. The body was covered, inside and out, in dry natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate harvested from dry lake beds in the Wadi Natron and elsewhere, prized for its ability to draw moisture from flesh with remarkable efficiency. Packets of natron were placed within the body cavity itself, and the entire form was then buried beneath a mounding layer of the salt, left to rest undisturbed for roughly 40 days. During this time, the priests did not merely wait. They continued their prayers, maintained the purity of the space, and prepared the materials that would be needed for the stages to follow. For embalming was not a passive process of chemical drying alone, but an ongoing act of devotion that had to be sustained without interruption. When the 40 days had passed, the body that emerged from beneath the natron was transformed, its tissues shrunken and darkened, its moisture almost entirely gone, its form lightened but its shape, remarkably, still recognizable. The priests removed the natron packing from the interior and washed the body once more, a second purification echoing the first, before beginning the process of restoration. Where desiccation had hollowed the face and body, giving the corpse a sunken, gaunt appearance unfitting for a king who was meant to appear whole and vital in the next world, the embalmers packed the cavities with linen, sawdust, or resin-soaked cloth, and in some cases modeled features back into the skin using subcutaneous packing beneath the surface. An early and remarkably skillful form of restorative art intended to return dignity and lifelike form to a body that had been reduced almost to husk. Oils and resins were then applied, layer upon layer, across the entire surface of the body. These substances served both practical and symbolic purposes at once. Practically, they helped to seal the skin, offering some resistance to further decay and to the insects that might otherwise threaten the corpse. Symbolically, their significance ran deeper still. Many of these resins, including frankincense and myrrh, were imported at great expense from regions along the Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula, and their rarity alone marked the body they touched as one of supreme importance. But beyond expense, these substances carried religious meaning bound up with the very language used to describe embalming. The word for a specific class of resin was closely tied to the concept of divinity itself, and Egyptian texts described the process of embalming as an act that transformed the deceased's flesh into something approaching the substance of the gods. The application of oil and resin was not cosmetic. It was a ritual assertion that the king's body was ceasing to be merely mortal matter and becoming instead something eternal, imperishable, godlike, fit to stand among Ra, Osiris, and Anubis in the world beyond. Only after this anointing did the wrapping begin, a stage that could itself extend across more than 2 weeks, so meticulous and layered was the process. Hundreds of yards of linen were required, torn or cut into strips of varying widths, some of it drawn from the finest cloth available, some of it, in a detail that startles modern sensibilities, reused from household linens or temple stores, since Egyptian religious thought placed greater weight on the purity of ritual and material than on the newness of cloth itself. The wrapping began with the extremities. Each finger and each toe was wrapped individually, a labor-intensive process reserved for the most privileged burials, ensuring that even the smallest parts of the king's body retained their distinct form. Individual gold stalls, thin sheaths of beaten gold, were fitted over the fingers and toes of Tutankhamun specifically, a mark of his royal status and a further expression of the belief that gold, incorruptible and gleaming, was the flesh of the gods, and that by covering his digits in it the embalmers were literally beginning the transformation of the king into a divine being. As the wrapping proceeded up the limbs and across the torso, the priest-lectors recited spells at each stage, and it was during this process that amulets were placed within the layers of linen, positioned according to precise prescriptions found in funerary texts. Every amulet held a specific protective function. The jed pillar, associated with the god Osiris, was placed to grant stability and endurance, evoking the backbone of the god of resurrection and, by extension, the strength of the deceased's own spine in the world to come. The Tayat knot, sometimes called the knot of Isis, invoked the protective magic of that goddess, who had famously reassembled the dismembered body of her husband Osiris, and through her devotion restored him to a kind of eternal life. The knot was believed to wrap the deceased in that same protective, restorative power. Winged scarabs, images of Horus, eyes of Horus known as Wedjat amulets representing wholeness and healing, and numerous other symbolic objects were tucked between the layers, each placed at a specific point on the body according to religious instruction, so that by the time the wrapping was complete, the king's body was not simply covered in cloth, but embedded within an intricate lattice of protective magic, every inch of him guarded by a different deity or symbol. Alongside the amulets, small folded papyri or inscribed linen bearing funerary spells, portions of what would later be called the Book of the Dead, were placed within the wrappings or laid upon the body, providing the king with the very words he would need to recite in the afterlife. Spells to open his mouth and eyes, to give him breath, to allow him to walk, to protect him from serpents and other hazards of the underworld, to guide him safely past the 42 divine judges he would face, before reaching the hall where his heart would be weighed. In effect, the wrapped body of Tutankhamun became a kind of sacred text in itself, layered with instructions and protections meant to be read not by the living but by the gods and demons the king would encounter on his journey. At intervals throughout the wrapping, additional coats of warm resin were applied, both to bind the layers of linen together and to provide further protection against moisture and decay. Toward the final stages, a mask was fitted over the head and shoulders of the mummy, resting atop the outermost layers of linen, its function to preserve the idealized features of the deceased and to ensure that his spirit, should it fail to recognize its own transformed and desiccated body, would still be able to identify itself by its face. For Tutankhamun, this mask would ultimately be the single most celebrated object to survive from ancient Egypt, though its placement at this stage in the embalmer's workshop was only the first and most private of the many times it would rest upon him. When at last the wrapping was finished, the body of the king, transformed, anointed, sealed within cloth and gold and spell, bore little outward resemblance to the young man who had ruled Egypt only weeks before. The priests had not merely preserved a corpse. In their own understanding, they had completed the first stage of a far greater transformation, converting a mortal ruler into Osiris himself. For every deceased Egyptian who underwent proper burial rites was addressed from that point onward by the name of the King of the Dead, becoming, in death, a manifestation of the god who had himself died and been restored to life by the devotion of his wife and the magic of embalming. Tutankhamun was no longer simply Tutankhamun. He was Osiris Tutankhamun, and it was in that identity that he would be carried to his tomb. Before the body left the embalmer's hands, one further rite awaited it, though it would be performed not in the workshop, but at the entrance to the tomb itself on the day of burial. The opening of the mouth ceremony, arguably the single most important ritual in the entire funerary sequence, for it was this rite, and this rite alone, that was believed to reanimate the senses of the deceased. Without it, all the careful preservation of the body, all the amulets and spells and gold, would have been for nothing, for the king would remain insensate, unable to see, hear, breathe, eat, or speak in the world beyond. The ceremony would be performed upon Tutankhamun's mummy, and also upon the statues that would accompany him into the tomb, for these too required animation if they were to serve as substitute bodies for the king's spirit should his physical form ever be damaged or destroyed. The rite itself, by tradition, fell to the heir or the closest surviving male relative of the deceased, and it was I, now positioned as regent and soon to be crowned king in his own right, who very likely performed this office for Tutankhamun, an act of profound symbolic importance that publicly established him as the legitimate successor even as it fulfilled his ritual obligation to the dead king. Standing before the wrapped and coffined body, propped upright for the occasion, the officiant touched the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose of the mummy or its funerary mask with a series of sacred instruments, and adze of meteoric iron, a tool associated with the stars and with materials that had fallen from the sky and were therefore considered to belong to the realm of the gods rather than the earth. A forked implement known as the peseshkef, small vessels of ritual liquid used for purification, and other tools whose precise forms were dictated by tradition stretching back over 1,000 years by Tutankhamun's time. Each touch of the instrument was accompanied by a recited spell, declaring that the mouth was opened, that the eyes could see, that the ears could hear, that the deceased could breathe and speak and eat once more. Incense was burned throughout, and ritual meals were offered and consumed symbolically, actions that echoed and fulfilled the perpetual offerings the dead were meant to receive from their descendants in the world of the living. Only once this rite had been performed was the king considered ready, in the fullest religious sense, to be sealed within his tomb, his body preserved, his organs guarded, his senses restored, his identity merged with that of Osiris, his path through the underworld charted by the spells that lay folded within his wrappings. What remained now was the placement of that body within the layered nest of coffins, shrines, and chambers that had been prepared, with whatever haste the circumstances demanded, to receive him. The tomb chosen for Tutankhamun lay within the Valley of the Kings, the great necropolis on the west bank of the Nile opposite Thebes, a place selected by New Kingdom rulers precisely because its narrow, hidden wadi, dominated by a natural pyramid-shaped peak the Egyptians associated with the goddess Meretseger, offered both concealment and religious resonance. A landscape of stark limestone cliffs standing in place of the constructed pyramids of earlier dynasties, whose visibility had made them irresistible targets for tomb robbers. By choosing a secluded valley rather than a monumental structure above ground, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom hoped to protect their eternal resting places through obscurity rather than mass, trading the visible grandeur of the Pyramid Age for a strategy of concealment that they hoped would prove more effective. History would prove this hope only partially justified. Tutankhamun's tomb, designated in modern times as KV62, was startlingly modest by the standards of royal burial. Where the tombs of kings such as Seti I or Ramesses the Great stretched for hundreds of feet into the hillside, descending through elaborately decorated corridors and multiple halls before reaching their burial chambers, Tutankhamun's tomb consisted of only 4 small rooms: a short entrance stairway and corridor, an antechamber, a burial chamber, and a small side room that would come to be called the annex, along with a further chamber known as the treasury opening off the burial chamber. Scholars examining the tomb's layout and architectural style have concluded that it was very likely not originally designed for a king at all, but rather begun as a tomb intended for a private individual or a lesser member of the royal family, then hastily adapted and repurposed when Tutankhamun died unexpectedly at a young age, leaving the court with insufficient time to complete or even begin construction of a tomb befitting his royal status. The proximity of KV62 to the tomb of I, along with certain stylistic parallels, has led some scholars to suggest the two men's tombs may even have been swapped in the confusion following the young king's death, with I, as the new ruler, taking possession of a larger tomb originally intended for Tutankhamun, while the modest space nearby was finished quickly to receive the deceased boy king. Whatever the precise sequence of events, the small scale of the tomb stands as physical testimony to the urgency and improvisation that marked Tutankhamun's burial, a hurried farewell rather than the culmination of years of careful preparation that other pharaohs had been afforded. Despite its modest size, the tomb's decoration, where it existed, was executed with care. The burial chamber alone was painted, its walls covered in scenes rendered against a background of vivid ochre yellow, a color choice unusual enough among royal tombs to have prompted scholarly comment, though it may simply reflect the specific religious texts chosen for that space. Principally scenes from the Amjuat, the ancient text describing the sun god's nightly journey through the 12 hours of the underworld, alongside images of the king before various deities, and a striking depiction of Tutankhamun's mummy being dragged upon a sledge by his officials, followed by a scene showing I himself performing the opening of the mouth ceremony upon the dead king, a rare instance in Egyptian art of the succeeding pharaoh depicted attending to his predecessor's funeral rites, further cementing the legitimacy of I's succession through this visual record. The burial itself, when it finally took place, followed the pattern expected of New Kingdom royal funerals, adapted as necessary to the circumstances. The mummified and coffined body of the king was carried from the embalmer's workshop across the river into the entrance of the Valley of the Kings, likely upon a sledge drawn by oxen or by teams of men, accompanied by mourners whose ritualized grief, including women depicted with disheveled hair and raised arms in period tomb paintings, was itself a required part of the ceremony. For the dead needed the outward demonstration of loss as confirmation of their worth and standing among the living. Priests walked before and beside the funeral cortege, burning incense and pouring libations along the path, while officials carried the vast array of grave goods that would accompany the king into his tomb, some of it likely still being assembled and finished even as the procession made its way toward the valley, a further indication of the haste under which the burial was conducted. Once within the tomb, the innermost stages of the burial took place. Tutankhamun's body, already wrapped and adorned within its wrappings with jewelry and amulets, had been placed inside a series of 3 nested coffins, an arrangement of extraordinary richness even by royal standards. The outermost 2 coffins were fashioned from wood, covered in gold foil and inlaid with colored glass and semi-precious stones, each shaped in the traditional form of the god Osiris, arms crossed over the chest holding the crook and flail, symbols of kingship and divine authority. The innermost coffin, however, was something altogether without parallel, crafted from more than 240 pounds of solid gold, inlaid with carnelian, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and colored glass. It remains the single most valuable and technically extraordinary object to survive from the ancient world, a final resting vessel whose material worth alone signaled the sacred status of the body it held. Gold being understood not as mere wealth, but, as with the finger stalls applied earlier, as the actual flesh of the gods made manifest. Resting directly upon the wrapped head and shoulders of the mummy within this innermost coffin was the golden mask, the object that would become, in the 20th century, the most recognizable image of ancient Egypt itself. Weighing over 22 pounds, fashioned from 2 sheets of gold hammered and burnished together, inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, quartz, obsidian, and colored glass, the mask depicted the king with the ceremonial false beard of divine kingship, wearing the Nemes headcloth striped in gold and deep blue, with the protective figures of the vulture goddess Nekbet and the cobra goddess Wajet arrayed across his brow, representing his sovereignty over Upper and Lower Egypt alike. The mask's purpose was not decorative but deeply functional within Egyptian religious logic. It ensured, as with all funerary masks, that the king's spirit would recognize his own transfigured, idealized face and be able to reunite with his body should the two ever become separated. And it further asserted his eternal identification with Osiris and with Ra, whose golden flesh the mask's material was meant to evoke. These nested coffins were placed within a rectangular stone sarcophagus carved from a single block of yellow quartzite, its corners guarded by 4 carved goddesses, Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Serket, their wings outstretched in a gesture of eternal protection around the king's body. The same four goddesses who watched over the canopic jars containing his organs, now doubled in their protective function at the very heart of the tomb. This sarcophagus, too heavy and too large to have been assembled after the tomb was sealed, must have been maneuvered into the burial chamber early in the process, its lid, notably, carved from red granite rather than matching quartzite, and bearing evidence of a repair to a crack sustained during its manufacture or transport. One more small sign among many of the improvisation that characterized this particular royal burial. Surrounding the sarcophagus, filling nearly the entire burial chamber, stood four gilded wooden shrines, nested one within another like a series of boxes, each covered in sheets of gesso and gold, and inscribed with protective texts and images of deities, so densely packed within the small chamber that only a few inches of clearance separated the outermost shrine from the chamber walls, requiring the priests who assembled them to have worked within extraordinarily tight and difficult conditions. These shrines represented, in miniature architectural form, chapels and processional structures from Egyptian religious tradition, and their layered arrangement around the sarcophagus mirrored the layered protections applied throughout every stage of the burial. Each barrier a further line of magical defense between the vulnerable body of the king and the forces of chaos that Egyptian religion held to be perpetually threatening the order of creation. The canopic equipment, containing the king's preserved organs, was housed in the adjoining treasury chamber, within an alabaster canopic chest of exceptional craftsmanship, itself protected by four small, gilded wooden figures of the goddesses Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Serket standing guard around it, echoing yet again the same protective quartet that appeared on the sarcophagus and among the amulets within the wrappings, a visual and religious rhyme repeated throughout the tomb that underscored how thoroughly Egyptian funerary religion depended on the layering and repetition of protective symbolism, as though sheer redundancy of divine guardianship could compensate for whatever vulnerabilities remained in the physical structure of the tomb itself. Beyond the coffins, shrines, and canopic equipment, the tomb was filled with an almost overwhelming abundance of objects, more than 5,000 individual items eventually cataloged by the archaeologists who would rediscover the tomb, and every category of object served a purpose rooted in Egyptian belief rather than simple ostentation. Life-sized statues of the king, painted black with gilded details, stood as guardians flanking the sealed entrance to the burial chamber, understood as Ka statues, vessels capable of housing the king's spiritual double should harm ever befall his physical body, ensuring that some form of him would always remain accessible to receive the offerings and prayers of the living. Model boats, carefully carved and rigged, provided the king with vessels for his journey across the waters of the underworld, echoing the solar bark in which the sun god Ra was believed to sail each night through the 12 hours of darkness described in the Amjuat painted upon the burial chamber walls. Furniture of extraordinary craftsmanship, including ornate chairs, beds, and chests, some of it clearly used during the king's actual lifetime rather than crafted specifically for burial, was included both to furnish the king's existence in the afterlife, which Egyptians envisioned as a continuation of earthly life rather than a wholly different state of being, and to provide him with the comfort and status appropriate to his royal rank. Weapons and military equipment, including bows, arrows, daggers, and shields, alongside 2 dismantled chariots, equipped Tutankhamun for the perils and pursuits of the world beyond, allowing him to hunt and, if necessary, to defend himself against the hostile forces that Egyptian funerary texts warned would attempt to bar his passage through the underworld. Board games, particularly numerous sets of the game Senet, were included not merely as royal pastimes, but carried genuine religious significance, for by this period in Egyptian belief, the game of Senet had come to be understood allegorically as a representation of the soul's journey through the afterlife itself, its squares corresponding to trials and outcomes along the path to the fields of the blessed, so that playing Senet in death was itself a kind of ritual navigation of the journey. Ahead, walking sticks, more than 130 of them found within the tomb, some finely carved, some plain, have been interpreted by some scholars in light of medical evidence, suggesting Tutankhamun suffered physical ailments in life that may have required such support, though they also carried the more universal symbolic association of authority and status befitting a king. Jewelry of astonishing craftsmanship, collars, pectorals, rings, and bracelets inlaid with precious and semi-precious stones adorned the king's mummified body and filled the boxes and chests stored throughout the tomb, each piece often carrying protective or symbolic significance tied to specific deities or concepts. Wealth and religious armor intertwined inseparably. Baskets and jars of food, bread, meat, fruit, and wine, along with numerous ceramic vessels, ensured that the king would not go hungry in the world to come, fulfilling the same nourishing function that living relatives were meant to provide through ongoing offerings at mortuary temples and tomb chapels, insurance against any failure of that continuing devotion by future generations. And scattered throughout the assemblage were countless smaller ritual objects, alabaster vessels for oils and unguents, faience amulets, shabti figures carved in the king's likeness, and inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead, compelling them to perform any agricultural labor demanded of the king in the afterlife, sparing him toil that would have been considered beneath his royal dignity, even in death. Every object within the tomb, in other words, answered to a specific religious need, arising from a coherent and deeply considered vision of what a king would require to live, rule, and thrive eternally, rather than from simple accumulation of wealth for its own sake. Once the burial chamber had been sealed behind its own blocked and plastered doorway, and the final rites had been performed, the outer chambers, the antechamber and annex, still open to the corridor, remained accessible for a short time longer, likely to permit the completion of final offerings or the placement of remaining objects, before these too were closed off. The entrance corridor was filled with rubble, the doorway plastered over and stamped with the seal of the royal necropolis. A jackal crouched above 9 bound captives, symbolizing Anubis's dominion over the enemies of the dead, alongside the seal of Tutankhamun himself. With that final act, the tomb was, in the fullest religious sense the Egyptians could conceive, complete. The king was interred, his body protected by layer upon layer of coffin, shrine, spell, and amulet, his tomb furnished with everything a king could need for eternity, sealed and consecrated, ready to stand undisturbed until the end of time. That expectation did not survive long. Within a relatively short span after the burial, likely within a few years or even months, the tomb was broken into, not once, but at least twice, by thieves who were remarkably well informed about what lay within and where to look for the most portable and valuable items. Ancient Egyptian tomb robbery was, perversely, almost an institutional hazard of the very system that produced such lavish burials, for the wealth interred with kings and nobles was an obvious and constant temptation in a society where poverty was common and where those involved in the construction and provisioning of tombs, workmen, priests, and officials, often possessed intimate knowledge of a tomb's layout and contents. The robbers who entered Tutankhamun's tomb targeted primarily small, valuable, and easily concealed items, precious oils and unguents contained in alabaster vessels, which they decanted, leaving the vessels themselves behind, gold jewelry, and small precious objects that could be pocketed and smuggled away. Evidence found by later excavators, including hastily repacked boxes and objects left in disarray, revealed clear signs of these ancient intrusions, along with equally clear signs that necropolis officials had discovered the break-ins relatively soon afterward, entered the tomb themselves to assess the damage, made an effort to restore some order, and then resealed the entrance corridor with fresh rubble and new necropolis seals. An ancient act of institutional damage control that, however, imperfect, proved decisive in the tomb's ultimate survival, for it was this careful resealing, rather than any accident of history, that helped prevent further, more thorough plundering in the centuries that followed. Not long after this final resealing, a combination of factors began the slow process by which Tutankhamun's tomb vanished from both sight and memory. Flash floods, a periodic but powerful feature of the Valley of the Kings despite its position within an arid landscape, swept debris and rock down from the surrounding cliffs, gradually burying the entrance corridor beneath layers of flood-washed limestone chips and sediment. Later, during the reign of Ramesses VI, more than a century after Tutankhamun's death, stone huts built to house the workmen constructing that later king's own tomb were erected directly above the buried entrance to KV 62. unknowingly, and quite literally covering the earlier king's tomb beneath the foundations of an active construction site, sealing it beneath. Layer of ancient rubbish, ash, and worked stone that would prove, over the following 3,000 years, to be one of the most effective forms of concealment any tomb in the valley ever received. As the centuries passed, the very memory of Tutankhamun faded from Egyptian consciousness in a manner unusually thorough even by the standards of a civilization that already practiced systematic historical revision. The successors of the Amarna period, beginning with Horemheb and continuing through the Ramesside dynasties, moved deliberately to erase the memory of the heretical interlude associated with Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. Despite having overseen Egypt's return to traditional religion, was nonetheless swept up in this erasure simply by association with the family and era that officialdom wished to forget. His name was omitted from later king lists compiled by subsequent pharaohs. Monuments bearing his name were usurped and reinscribed with the names of his successors, and within a few generations, the boy king who had briefly ruled Egypt at the close of the 18th dynasty had been almost entirely written out of his own civilization's official memory. The Valley of the Kings itself continued to be used and later abandoned as a royal burial ground, was picked over by robbers across the following centuries and millennia, was visited by Greek and Roman tourists who left graffiti upon the walls of more accessible tombs, and was eventually surveyed, mapped, and partially excavated by the early archaeologists and adventurers of the 19th century, several of whom worked within a stone's throw of Tutankhamun's tomb without ever suspecting it. Untouched royal burial lay buried beneath their feet. By the early 20th century, most serious Egyptologists had come to believe that the Valley of the Kings had given up all its secrets, that every tomb worth finding had already been found, and that further excavation in the valley was, at best, a matter of diminishing returns. It was against this backdrop of professional skepticism that Howard Carter, an Englishman who had first arrived in Egypt as a teenager to work as a draftsman and artist copying tomb decorations, built the career that would eventually lead him to challenge that consensus. Carter had spent decades in Egyptian archaeology by the time of his great discovery, working his way up from illustrator to inspector of antiquities for the Egyptian government, gaining a deep, practical knowledge of the Valley of the Kings and its surrounding terrain that few of his contemporaries could match, developed through long years of fieldwork rather than academic theorizing alone. Carter's path to Tutankhamun's tomb was neither swift nor certain. His professional fortunes had suffered a serious setback years before the discovery, following a diplomatic incident in which he sided with Egyptian guards against disrespectful foreign visitors, a stance that cost him his official position and left him, for a period, working as a painter and antiquities dealer to survive. It was in these leaner years that he came to the attention of George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a wealthy English aristocrat with a passion for Egyptology and, crucially, the financial resources to fund sustained excavation. Their partnership, beginning in the years before the First World War, would prove one of the most consequential collaborations in the history of archaeology, Carnarvon supplying the funding and social standing that opened doors within Egypt's colonial administrative structure, Carter supplying the expertise, tenacity, and instinct that would eventually make the partnership famous. For years, that instinct produced disappointment after disappointment. Carter had become convinced, based on scattered fragments of evidence, including small artifacts bearing Tutankhamun's name discovered by earlier excavators in an unremarkable pit elsewhere in the valley, that the young king's tomb remained undiscovered somewhere within the valley floor, its location obscured by debris and the passage of time rather than lost through any prior thorough excavation. He secured the concession to dig in the valley and, season after season beginning in 1917, directed painstaking excavations, moving enormous quantities of rock and rubble, uncovering little of significance, and steadily exhausting both his own patience and Lord Carnarvon's financial reserves and enthusiasm. By 1922, after 5 years of largely fruitless searching, Carnarvon, weighing the mounting costs against the absence of results, informed Carter that he intended to withdraw his financial support, effectively signaling the end of the search. Carter, in a meeting later, recounted as one of the pivotal moments in the story, persuaded his patron to fund one final season, offering to bear a portion of the costs himself, and proposing a specific, narrowly defined area of the valley floor, close to the entrance of the nearby tomb of Ramesses VI, that had not yet been thoroughly explored precisely because ancient workmen's huts sat atop it, a site others had passed over rather than disturb. Carter returned to Egypt in the autumn of 1922 to begin what he and his small team of workmen understood might be their last opportunity. On the 1st of November, excavation began in the area beneath the ancient workmen's huts. Within days, on the morning of the 4th of November, one of Carter's workmen uncovered a single stone step cut into the bedrock beneath the debris, a discovery that stopped the excavation in its tracks and sent a current of controlled excitement through the entire team, for a cut step in that location suggested, unmistakably, the presence of a constructed entrance rather than natural rock. Carter ordered the excavation to proceed with heightened care, and as the workmen cleared away the surrounding debris, a full stairway began to emerge, cut downward into the limestone, its steps descending toward what could only be a sealed doorway. By the following day, the 12th step had been uncovered, revealing the upper portion of a plastered doorway bearing the unmistakable seal impressions of the royal necropolis, the jackal and 9 captives, and, crucially, seal impressions that appeared to bear the name of Tutankhamun himself. Carter, restraining an excitement he later described with characteristic understatement, made the fateful decision not to proceed further without his patron present. He sent an urgent telegram to Lord Carnarvon in England, informing him of the discovery of a tomb with intact seals in the valley and requesting his immediate presence in Egypt, then ordered the stairway rebarred and guarded around the clock while he waited the nearly 3 weeks it took for Carnarvon, accompanied by his daughter Lady Evelyn Herbert, to travel from England to Luxor. When Carnarvon and his daughter finally arrived toward the end of November, the stairway was reopened and the full doorway was exposed, revealing that while the upper seals bore Tutankhamun's name, the lower portion of the door showed clear evidence of having been resealed at some point after the original burial, a telling sign, confirmed only once the door was breached, that the tomb had suffered at least one ancient intrusion, though how much had been disturbed within remained entirely unknown. On the 26th of November, 1922, Carter, Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, and Carter's colleague Arthur Callender gathered before the sealed doorway at the base of the stairway. Carter made a small breach in the upper left corner of the door, just large enough to insert a candle and peer through into the darkness beyond, testing first for foul air, a standard and prudent precaution before any Egyptologist entered a long-sealed space. As his eyes adjusted to the candlelight within, Carter beheld a chamber crowded almost beyond comprehension with a chaotic profusion of extraordinary objects, gilded couches in the shape of animals, dismantled chariots, gleaming statues, alabaster vases, and countless other treasures glinting in the flickering light, an image so overwhelming after years of careful, patient, often disappointing excavation that Carter, for a long moment, could not speak. It was Lord Carnarvon, standing anxiously behind him in the passage, who finally broke the silence, asking whether Carter could see anything. And Carter, still peering through the small gap into the golden chaos beyond, gave the reply that would become one of the most famous utterances in the history of archaeology. Yes, wonderful things. What followed that extraordinary moment was not the swift plunder of treasure that popular imagination might expect, but instead the beginning of one of the most meticulous and painstaking archaeological excavations ever undertaken, a process that would ultimately consume nearly a decade of Carter's life. Recognizing the unprecedented scale and fragility of what had been found, Carter assembled a team of specialists, photographers, chemists, and conservators to document and preserve the tomb's contents before anything was moved, understanding that the scientific value of the discovery depended entirely on careful, systematic recording rather than hurried removal. Every object was photographed in situ, numbered, sketched, and only then carefully lifted, treated where necessary with preservative chemicals to stabilize deteriorating materials, and transported the short distance to a nearby empty tomb that had been converted into a makeshift conservation laboratory. The antechamber alone took months to clear. The burial chamber, once the outer shrine doors were finally opened in February of 1923 before an audience of dignitaries and journalists, revealed the nested shrines and sarcophagus in a moment nearly as dramatic as the tomb's initial discovery. It would be nearly 3 more years before the innermost coffin was opened and the golden mask revealed to the world in October of 1925. So exacting was the pace Carter insisted upon despite intense public and professional pressure to move faster. That pressure arose because the discovery had, almost overnight, become a global sensation. News of the intact royal tomb, complete with its almost unimaginable wealth of golden treasures, spread rapidly through international newspapers, feeding a public appetite for spectacle and mystery that the story satisfied on every level. Crowds gathered outside the Valley of the Kings hoping for a glimpse of the excavation. Fashion, architecture, jewelry, and interior design across Europe and North America absorbed motifs drawn from Egyptian art in a wave of popular enthusiasm that came to be known as Egyptomania, or Tutmania specifically, a craze that touched everything from cinema to advertising to the naming of consumer products. Much of this fervor was fueled by an exclusive arrangement Lord Carnarvon struck with the Times of London, granting that paper alone privileged access to news from the excavation, a decision that alienated other outlets and, in turn, encouraged those excluded publications to seek out sensational angles of their own, setting the stage for the mythology that would soon attach itself to the discovery. That mythology crystallized with startling speed following the death of Lord Carnarvon in April of 1923, less than 5 months after the tomb's opening, from an infected mosquito bite that developed into blood poisoning and pneumonia, compounded by his already fragile health following a serious car accident decades earlier. The timing of his death, so soon after the tomb's opening, proved irresistible to sections of the press, and the legend of the curse of the pharaohs was born almost immediately, amplified by a handful of subsequent deaths among individuals loosely connected to the excavation, and lent an aura of the sensational by public remarks from figures such as the novelist Arthur Conan Doyle, who publicly speculated that occult forces might have been responsible for Carnarvon's demise. Journalists eagerly reported rumors of an inscribed curse supposedly found at the tomb's entrance threatening death to those who disturbed the king's rest, though no such inscription was ever actually documented by Carter or any member of his team. Examined against the historical and medical record, the curse narrative does not withstand scrutiny. Howard Carter himself, the individual who had by far the most direct and prolonged contact with the tomb and its contents, lived for another 17 years after the discovery, dying in 1939 of natural causes at the age of 64. Hardly the outcome one would expect were any genuine curse in operation. Statistical analyses conducted by researchers in later decades, examining the lifespans of those present at the tomb's opening compared with other individuals of similar age and background in the same period, found no meaningful difference in mortality, undermining any claim of a supernatural pattern. Lord Carnarvon's death is far more plausibly explained by the mundane realities of pre-antibiotic medicine and his own long-compromised health than by any pharaonic malediction. The curse persists in popular culture not because of any credible evidence, but because it satisfies a deep and enduring human appetite for mystery and retribution, a story too dramatically satisfying, following so spectacular a discovery, for the press and public imagination of the 1920s to resist, and one that has continued to be recycled and embellished by popular media ever since, standing as a case study in how sensational journalism can create enduring myth from the ordinary tragedies of chance and disease. In the centuries since its discovery, Tutankhamun's tomb and its contents have remained the subject of continuous scientific study, conservation, and, at times, controversy, as archaeologists and conservators have worked to balance the competing demands of preservation, research, and public access to one of the most visited and studied archaeological sites in the world. The extraordinary fame of the discovery, paradoxically, brought its own dangers, as decades of tourist visitation introduced humidity, carbon dioxide, and physical wear that threatened the delicate wall paintings within the burial chamber, prompting Egyptian authorities, working with international conservation bodies, to undertake extensive projects in recent decades to stabilize the tomb's environment, including the construction of a precise full-scale replica of the burial chamber near the valley, allowing visitors to experience the tomb's decoration without subjecting the fragile original to further damage from crowds. The golden mask itself underwent a significant and closely scrutinized conservation effort after a 2014 incident in which its braided beard was accidentally detached and hastily reattached with an inappropriate adhesive, an episode that prompted a more careful, reversible restoration and renewed international attention to the standards required for handling objects of such singular historical value. Beyond conservation, the 21st century has brought a wave of scientific investigation into Tutankhamun's mummy itself, employing tools and techniques unimaginable to Carter and his generation. Computed tomography scans, conducted in 2005 and refined in subsequent studies, allowed researchers to examine the king's skeleton and soft tissue in unprecedented detail without physically disturbing the fragile remains, revealing a young man who stood approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, was in generally slight physical build, and had died at approximately 18 or 19 years of age, somewhat older estimates than earlier assumptions had suggested. The scans also revealed a badly fractured left leg, sustained shortly before death, along with evidence of a club foot and other developmental abnormalities, findings that reopened long-standing debate over the cause of the young king's death. Earlier theories, popular through much of the 20th century, had speculated that Tutankhamun was murdered, pointing to fragmentary and ultimately inconclusive evidence, including a once-cited but now largely discounted suggestion of trauma to the back of the skull. Modern scholarship has moved substantially away from theories of assassination, favoring explanations rooted in the king's evident physical frailty. DNA analysis conducted in 2010, alongside the CT data, revealed that Tutankhamun suffered from a genetic condition affecting bone density and identified genetic markers for malaria in his tissue, findings that led researchers to propose that a combination of the broken leg, potentially resulting in a fatal infection, compounded by malaria and an already weakened constitution, may have caused or substantially contributed to his death. This remains, it should be emphasized, an area of ongoing scholarly discussion rather than settled consensus. Some researchers have questioned aspects of the malaria findings and the interpretation of the leg fracture, and no single account of the cause of death commands universal agreement among specialists, a reminder that even with modern scientific tools, some historical questions resist definitive resolution. The same DNA studies shed significant light on Tutankhamun's family relationships, confirming through genetic analysis that his parents were siblings or close relatives, a practice of consanguineous marriage not uncommon within the Egyptian royal family, intended to preserve the purity and exclusivity of the royal bloodline, but one that modern genetics recognizes as a likely contributor to the king's documented health difficulties, including his bone condition and other physical anomalies. Observed in the scans, the identity of Tutankhamun's mother remains a matter of ongoing scholarly investigation. Genetic evidence points to a mummy discovered in a side chamber of a nearby tomb, sometimes referred to by researchers as the younger lady, as his mother, though her precise identity among the known royal women of the period continues to be debated, with some scholars proposing she may have been a full or half-sister of Akhenaten rather than the more famous Queen Nefertiti, a conclusion drawn from genetic data that has itself been the subject of continued scientific refinement and discussion. What the evidence does establish with reasonable confidence is that Tutankhamun's parents were themselves siblings or very close relations, and that 2 mummified fetuses found within his own tomb, long assumed to represent stillborn daughters of the king and his wife Ankhesenamun, offer poignant testimony to a royal couple who appear to have been unable to produce a surviving heir, a further, deeply human dimension to the tragedy of a reign cut short before it could fully establish itself. It is worth pausing, in light of all this modern scientific inquiry, to consider precisely why Tutankhamun, a king who ruled for less than a decade, who ascended the throne as a child and died before reaching full adulthood, who left behind no great military conquests, no vast new temples built in his own singular vision, and who was, by the political and religious standards the Egyptians themselves valued most, a comparatively minor figure among the pharaohs, nonetheless became, by a wide margin, the most famous ruler ancient Egypt ever produced. The answer lies not in the accomplishments of his brief life, but in the singular accident of his tomb's survival. Nearly every other pharaoh whose achievements dwarfed Tutankhamun's, kings who reigned for decades, expanded Egypt's borders, and constructed monuments that still stand today, had their tombs discovered empty or nearly so, their treasures stripped away by ancient robbers within decades or centuries of burial, their mummies, where they survived at all, found stripped of jewelry, sometimes even removed from their original resting places entirely and hidden by ancient priests attempting to protect them from further desecration. Tutankhamun alone, through the accident of his small and hastily hidden tomb, through the flood debris and the workmen's huts that unknowingly sealed his resting place beneath the sands for more than 3,000 years, was found essentially intact, his treasures undisturbed, his burial complete, offering the modern world an unprecedented and unrepeated window into the full material reality of Egyptian royal burial, as it was actually practiced, rather than as it could only be reconstructed from fragments and later robbery. It is this completeness, this singular preservation, that transformed a minor king into a global icon. Where history remembers Ramesses the Great for his monuments and his military campaigns, and Akhenaten for his radical religious revolution, it remembers Tutankhamun for the sheer, overwhelming physical beauty and abundance of what was found within his tomb, for the golden mask that has become, arguably, the single most recognized artifact from the ancient world, and for the human story of Howard Carter's decades of patient searching culminating in that one extraordinary moment of candlelight and gold. The tomb offered proof, tangible and dazzling, of everything historians and the public alike had imagined about the wealth and sophistication of pharaonic Egypt, made suddenly, vividly real. There is a fitting symmetry in this outcome, one that the ancient Egyptians themselves, with their profound belief in the power of preservation to secure eternal life, might have recognized and appreciated, even if they could not have anticipated its particular form. The entire elaborate apparatus of mummification, of coffins within coffins, of shrines and spells and protective amulets, existed to accomplish a single overriding purpose: to ensure that the deceased would not simply vanish into oblivion, that some essential trace of the person, their name, their form, their story, would endure beyond the finality of physical death. For most pharaohs, that ambition was only partially realized, their names surviving in inscriptions and king lists even as their bodies and treasures were scattered and lost to robbery and time. For Tutankhamun, uniquely among all the kings of Egypt, that ambition succeeded beyond anything the ancient priests who sealed his tomb could have imagined. His body has been examined by scientists using tools that draw on knowledge of physics and genetics unimaginable to the ancient world. His face, rendered in gold by artisans working under brutal time pressure more than 3,000 years ago, is recognized today by people on every continent who have never set foot in Egypt and may know almost nothing else about the civilization that produced him. His name, nearly erased from history by his own successors within a generation of his death, is now spoken and written more often than that of almost any other pharaoh who ever lived, in every language on earth. Many kings ruled longer. Many conquered greater lands, raised taller monuments, and left behind more enduring political legacies within their own time. But it was this young king, whose body entered the embalmer's workshop beneath the authority of Anubis at the beginning of this story, who was wrapped in linen and gold, sealed within shrine after shrine in a hurried tomb never meant for a king, forgotten beneath the sands for more than 3,000 years, and finally, in the flickering light of a single candle held by an English archaeologist who had almost given up hope, brought back into the light of human memory. It was Tutankhamun, not through conquest or grandeur, but through the strange and unrepeatable accident of preservation, who ultimately achieved the very immortality the ancient Egyptians sought so fervently for every soul that passed into the West. His tomb promised eternity to a king who ruled only briefly, and against every ancient expectation of how that promise might be fulfilled, it kept its word.